The chandeliers alone cost more than most people earn in a decade. 12,000 hand-cut Swarovski crystals hung suspended above the Grand Meridian Ballroom on Manhattan's Upper East Side, each one catching the light and throwing it back in tiny rainbows that danced across silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The Armitage Hart Foundation's annual gala had drawn 700 of New York's most powerful people into one room: hedge fund managers, tech moguls, society matrons dripping in diamonds, and enough political influence to reshape legislation over cocktails. It was the kind of evening where a single handshake could birth a billion-dollar merger, where champagne flowed at $400 a bottle, and where everyone pretended they weren't watching everyone else. But tonight, all eyes were fixed on one man. Kellen Armitage stood at the podium on the elevated stage, bathed in the warm glow of a single spotlight. At 52 years old, he remained the kind of man that photographers loved, 6'2" with silver threading through dark, hair that only made him look more distinguished, a jaw that belonged on currency, and eyes the color of a winter storm. His midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo had been custom-fitted that morning, the fabric skimming. Shoulders that still carried the broadness of the college athlete he'd once been. He was, by every measure that Manhattan society cared about, the perfect man. Founder and CEO of Armitage Global Industries, net worth hovering somewhere around $11 billion depending on which publication you trusted. Philanthropist, visionary, the man who'd revolutionized sustainable energy infrastructure while somehow making it profitable. Forbes had him on their cover 3 times. Time magazine twice. He'd shaken hands with 4 presidents and turned down ambassadorships because, as he'd told interviewers, with that trademark half-smile, "I can do more good from a boardroom than an embassy." The crowd before him glittered with admiration. They'd each paid $25,000 a plate to be here, to support cardiac research, to be seen supporting cardiac research, and, most importantly, to breathe the same air as Kellen Armitage. He smiled at them, and camera flashes erupted like silent fireworks. But if anyone had been watching closely, really watching, not just admiring, they might have noticed something off. His left hand gripped the edge of the podium with slightly too much force, his knuckles pressing white against the polished mahogany. When he shifted his weight, there was a subtle sway, barely perceptible, like a tall building absorbing wind it shouldn't have felt. His right hand moved to adjust his bow tie, then drifted down to rest against his chest, fingers pressing briefly against his sternum before he caught himself and lowered it back to his side. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. No one noticed. "Good evening," Kellen began, his voice carrying rich and warm through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I want to thank each of you for being here tonight. Your generosity over the past 12 years has funded research that saved an estimated 30,000 lives." Applause rippled through the ballroom. Kellen waited for it to fade, using the moment to take a breath that felt shorter than it should have. There was pressure in his chest, not pain exactly, just pressure, like someone had placed a hand flat against his heart and was leaning in. He'd felt it earlier in the car, had ignored it. He'd felt it during cocktail hour, had medicated it with a smile and a glass of water when he'd wanted whiskey. He was fine. He was always fine. That's what Kellen Armitage did. He pushed through, performed, delivered. The teleprompter glowed with his speech. Words he'd approved that afternoon, statistics, and gratitude, and a carefully crafted call to action for increased donations. His eyes tracked the text, but the letters seemed to swim slightly, rearranging themselves like they were written in a language he was forgetting. He blinked hard, focused. "The heart," he continued, "is a remarkable organ. It beats 100,000 times a day, 40 million times a year, without ever asking for recognition or rest. It simply works. Unlike mine," he thought, and almost laughed at the irony of giving a speech about cardiac health while his own chest felt like it was slowly filling with concrete. He'd skipped the cardiology appointment last month, and the one before that. There was always a board meeting, a flight to catch, a deal to close. His assistant had reminded him 7 times. His physician had left voicemails that grew increasingly stern. He deleted them all. Kellen Armitage did not have time to be sick. He had empires to run. But for millions of Americans he pressed on. That tireless muscle betrays them. often without warning, often. The pain sharpened. It wasn't gradual this time. It hit like a blade sliding between his ribs, stealing the breath from his lungs mid-sentence. His hand flew to his chest, no longer subtle, no longer controllable. The pressure had become a fist, squeezing, crushing, demanding attention he'd refused to give for far too long. The teleprompter words dissolved into meaningless shapes. The chandeliers seemed to multiply, their light fracturing into painful shards. And then, through the haze of his failing vision, Kellen's eyes found a face in the crowd. Third row, aisle seat. A woman in an emerald dress, her dark hair swept up, her hand frozen halfway to her wine glass. He knew that face. He knew it the way you know your own reflection, the way you know the lyrics to a song you haven't heard in 20 years. He knew the exact shade of those brown eyes, knew how they looked first thing in the morning, knew how they looked filled with tears on the day she'd walked away from him. No, it can't be. She was staring at him with an expression that was equal parts horror and recognition, and in that fraction of a second, that suspended moment between standing and falling, Kellen felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart. Memories he'd buried, regret he'd converted into ambition, love he'd told himself had been a weakness he'd outgrown. It all came flooding back in a single, devastating wave. Clara. Her name was a prayer he'd stopped allowing himself to speak. Mr. Armitage? The voice came from somewhere to his left, concerned, professional. Sir, are you? The microphone caught his fall before his body did. The screech of feedback ripped through the ballroom like a scream, and then Kellen Armitage, billionaire, visionary, the man who had everything, crumpled to the stage floor like a puppet whose strings had been severed. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The crowd sat frozen in their seats, champagne glasses suspended, mouths open, brains struggling to process what their eyes had just witnessed. This was not part of the program. This was not supposed to happen. Men like Kellen Armitage did not collapse at their own charity galas. They did not fall. They did not fail. They did not remind everyone watching that money could not buy immortality. Then chaos erupted. Someone call 911. Is there a doctor? Give him air. Everyone move back. A woman in the front row screamed, the sound piercing through the cacophony of scraping chairs and panicked voices. Security personnel rushed the stage, their training kicking in even as their faces betrayed their shock. Somewhere in the back, a photographer kept shooting, capturing the moment that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. And in the third row, Clara Morrison, because she'd taken her maiden name back, shed his like a skin. She couldn't wear anymore, sat completely still while the world around her dissolved into pandemonium. Her heart had stopped the moment his had started failing. Kellen, after 15 years of carefully constructed distance, of moved cities and changed numbers and a life rebuilt brick by painstaking brick, fate had just thrown her back into the orbit of the only man she'd ever truly loved, the only man she'd ever truly hated, the only man who had no idea what he'd left behind when he'd chosen his ambition over their marriage. She didn't realize she was standing until she was already pushing through the crowd toward the stage, her body, moving independent of her mind, pulled toward him by a gravity she'd spent 15 years trying to escape. 15 years earlier, Northbridge University, Pennsylvania. Northbridge University sat 40 miles outside Philadelphia, in a town that tourism had forgotten and prosperity had never visited. The campus was a collection of brick buildings that had seen better decades, their facades stained, with decades of industrial pollution that no amount of pressure washing could fully erase. The grass was patchy in places where too many students had cut across the quad to save 30 seconds. The library's heating system worked only on floors 1 and 3. The dormitories smelled permanently of cheap ramen and desperation. It was not the kind of school that produced billionaires. It was the kind of school that produced survivors, kids who'd clawed their way to a degree through scholarships and work-study programs, and the sheer stubborn refusal to become another statistic in their hometowns. They came from rusted-out factory towns and forgotten farming communities, from trailer parks and public housing, from families where college was a foreign word spoken with either reverence or suspicion. Kellen Armitage was one of them. At 22 years old, he was tall and too thin, surviving on dining hall meals and the occasional free pizza at campus events. His wardrobe consisted of 3 pairs of jeans, 5 t-shirts, 2 button-downs, for presentations, and a winter coat he'd bought secondhand for $12. He owned exactly 1 suit, purchased at a thrift store in freshman year, which he'd worn to every interview, every networking event. Every moment that demanded he pretend he belonged among people who'd never worried about whether the electricity would stay on. He was a senior business major with a 3.9 gigapascals, a work-study job in the financial aid office, and a chip on his shoulder the size of the state he'd escaped. His father had died when he was 11, heart attack on the factory floor, no life insurance, no savings. His mother had worked 2 jobs after that and still hadn't managed to keep the water running every month. She'd remarried when he was 15 to a man who drank more than he earned and made. It clear that Kellen was an inconvenience he'd inherited, not a son he'd chosen. Kellen left home at 18 with a suitcase, $300, and a promise to himself that he would never be poor again. That promise lived in his bones like a second skeleton. It drove him through all-night study sessions and unpaid internships, and the constant, grinding anxiety that one wrong step would send him tumbling back to where he'd started. He didn't go to parties. He didn't waste weekends. He didn't allow himself distractions. Until November 14th. Until her. The coffee shop was called The Grind, and it occupied a cramped corner of the student union that perpetually smelled of burnt espresso and ambition. It was the only place on campus open past midnight, which made it sacred ground for students pulling all-nighters and the staff unlucky enough to work the closing shift. Noelle Chen was both. She'd been a barista there since sophomore year, working 25 hours a week on top of a full course load because her scholarship covered tuition but not books, not housing deposits, not the 100 small expenses. That added up to the difference between surviving and drowning. Her mother had cleaned houses in Boston for 2 decades to get her here, had scrubbed toilets and ironed shirts and smiled through condescension, so her daughter could have choices she'd never had. Noelle carried that knowledge like a compass, every decision oriented toward making her mother's sacrifice worth something. At 21, she was small and sharp-featured, with dark hair she kept in, a practical ponytail and eyes that noticed everything while revealing little. She laughed easily but trusted slowly. She made excellent coffee and even better grades. She was majoring in nursing because she wanted to help people and because nurses were always needed everywhere, which meant security. Security was the only luxury she'd ever learned to want. On November 14th, at exactly 4:47 p.m., she was carrying a tray of 6 lattes to a table of study group students when the collision happened. He came around the corner at full speed, long legs, messenger bag swinging, eyes on his phone where an email from a potential internship contact had just arrived and demanded immediate analysis. He was calculating how to respond, what to say, how to sound confident, without sounding arrogant, professional without sounding desperate. And then there was impact. The tray went flying. 6 lattes achieved brief, spectacular flight before surrendering to gravity. The study group gasped. A laptop narrowly escaped destruction. Kellen's white button-down, his good button-down, the one he'd been saving for tomorrow's interview, absorbed approximately 4 shots of espresso and 2 pumps of vanilla syrup. For 1 terrible second, nobody moved. Noelle stared at the devastation, at the spreading brown stain on his chest, at the coffee dripping from her empty tray onto shoes that had clearly seen better years, at the face of the tall stranger who'd just destroyed her perfect no-spill record. And then, inexplicably, inappropriately, completely beyond her control, she started laughing. It bubbled up from somewhere deep, the kind of laughter that arrives when the universe becomes so absurd that the only reasonable response is surrender. She laughed until her eyes watered, until she had to put a hand on the counter to steady herself, until the stranger's expression shifted from horror to confusion, to something that looked dangerously like amusement. "I am so sorry," he said, looking down at his ruined shirt. "I wasn't watching where I was going, and You're apologizing to me?" She wiped her eyes, still giggling. "I just gave you a coffee bath. You look like you lost a fight with a Starbucks. I think technically we both lost. He gestured at her apron, which had also sustained casualties. Mutual destruction, mutually assured caffeination. She grabbed a handful of napkins from the dispenser and thrust them toward him. Here, not that these will help. That shirt is a lost cause. It was my interview shirt. He dabbed uselessly at the stain. Had a meeting with a finance company tomorrow. Oh no. Her laughter finally died. I'm so sorry. I don't know, pay for dry cleaning? He actually smiled at that, and something in Noelle's chest did a small, unexpected flip. Have you seen what dry cleaning costs? He said. Neither of us can afford that. I'll figure something out. Maybe I'll start a trend. Brown-stained business casual, very avant-garde, very unemployable. He extended a hand, the gesture oddly formal, given that he was currently dripping espresso onto the linoleum. Kellen Armitage, professional walking disaster. She shook it. Noelle Chen, professional tray-carrying failure, apparently. I think this was entirely my fault. Let's call it 50-50. She nodded toward the counter. Let me make you a replacement. On the house. Since you're wearing the first batch, you don't have to. I want to. Consider it an apology. And also a bribe so you don't report me to my manager. She made him a double shot Americano because he looked like he needed it, and he sat at the counter while she cleaned up the mess, and somehow they started talking. About his interview, about her shift, about the impossible cost of textbooks, and the specific exhaustion of being a student who worked and a worker who studied. He missed his study group meeting. She forgot to restock the pastry case. Neither of them noticed. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He told himself it was because the grind had the best coffee on campus, which was technically true. Noelle took her craft seriously, but mostly false as a motivation. He told himself it was because he needed caffeine to fuel his endless cycle of studying and networking and planning. Also technically true, also mostly false. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He wanted to see her. Kellen Armitage, who had spent 4 years treating human connection as a distraction from his goals, who had carefully avoided anything that might slow his climb toward the security he craved, suddenly found himself restructuring his entire schedule around a barista's shift times. It was, he recognized dimly, a very bad sign. He didn't care. He started staying until close on her late nights, helping her stack chairs and wipe down tables while they talked. She'd make them both decaf. If I drink more caffeine after 10 p.m., I'll vibrate through the floor, she explained. And they'd sit in the empty shop, the only light coming from the display case, and they'd talk about everything. About his father. He was a good man, Kellen said one night, his hands wrapped around his mug. Worked 30 years at the same plant. Never complained. Never asked for more than he had. And then one day his heart just stopped. Right there on the assembly line. I was in 6th period English when they pulled me out to tell me. Noelle's hand covered his. She didn't say anything. Sometimes, silence was the only appropriate response. I think about it constantly, he continued. How he gave everything to that job, and in the end, it didn't save him. Didn't save us. My mom couldn't pay the mortgage. We lost the house 8 months later. She had to move us in with her sister, and her sister made sure we knew every single day that we were charity cases. That's not charity, that's cruelty. Maybe. But it taught me something. His jaw tightened. I'm never going to be in a position where I need someone else's mercy to survive. I'm going to build something so big, so solid that no one can ever take it away from me. Noelle studied him in the dim light. What about the people around you while you're building it? What do you mean? I mean, she chose her words carefully. My mom works harder than anyone I know, has her whole life. And she's not rich, she's not powerful. But she's happy. She told me once that some people are rich in money, some people are rich in time, and some people are rich in love. And that you should be very careful not to spend one trying to buy another. Kellen was quiet for a long moment. That's beautiful, he said finally. But love doesn't keep the lights on. No, Noelle agreed. But all the lights in the world won't keep you warm if there's no one there to sit with you. He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't push for one. 3 weeks after the coffee collision, he asked her to meet him on the library roof. It was technically against campus rules, but the maintenance door lock had been broken since 1987, and the administration had never bothered to fix it. Students had been sneaking up there for decades, leaving behind carved initials and empty bottles and the ghosts of 1,000 conversations held under open sky. Kellen arrived first, spreading out a blanket he'd borrowed from his roommate and arranging the picnic he'd assembled, sandwiches from the dining hall, apples stolen from the breakfast line, 2 chocolate bars purchased with money he should have spent on laundry. Noelle found him there at sunset, the sky streaked with oranges and pinks that made Northbridge almost look beautiful. "You're serious," she said, taking in the scene. "An actual picnic. I know it's not fancy. It's perfect." She sat down beside him. "No one's ever made me a picnic before." "Well, the dining hall technically made the sandwiches. You assembled them. That counts." They ate as the sun finished its descent, watching the campus lights flicker on one by one, listening to the distant sounds of students heading to the library or the gym or anywhere but the rooftop where 2 people were quietly, carefully falling in love. "Tell me something true," Noelle said suddenly. "Something you've never told anyone else." Kellen considered the question. Considered her. Considered the strange and terrifying trust that had grown between them in a matter of weeks. "I'm scared all the time," he admitted. "Every single day. That I'm not good enough. That I'll fail. That I'll end up exactly where I started, and everyone who ever bet against me will be right." "What do you do with that fear?" "I use it. I let it push me." He turned to look at her. "What about you?" "Something true." Noelle pulled her knees to her chest. "I'm scared too, but not of failure. I'm scared of ending up with someone who loves their work more than they love me, like my dad." "Your dad?" "He left when I was 7, had a chance at a promotion in California, chose the job." She shrugged, the gesture too practiced to be casual. "Some people just can't love anything more than their own ambition." The words landed between them like a stone in still water. Kellen reached over and took her hand. She let him. "I'm going to build something huge someday," he said quietly. "Something that matters. I have to. It's the only way I know to make sure I'm never powerless again. I know. But I don't want to become what you're describing. Someone who loses everything that matters while chasing something that doesn't." She squeezed his fingers. "Then don't." "How do I make sure?" Noelle turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "You keep people close who'll tell you when you're losing yourself. Who'll pull you back before you go too far. People like who?" She smiled. "Well, I'm not doing anything for the next 40 or 50 years." He laughed, really laughed, the sound startling in the quiet night, and something shifted in his chest. Something that felt like possibility, like hope, like the first real warmth he'd felt since he was 11 years old, and the world had taught him that caring about people only led to losing them. "Is that a promise?" he asked. "Consider it a standing offer." He kissed her then. It was not a cinematic kiss. There was no swelling orchestra, no perfectly timed fireworks, no dramatic declaration. It was small and soft and slightly awkward, their noses bumping before they found the right angle. It tasted like chocolate and uncertainty, and the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. When they pulled apart, her eyes were bright. "Don't let it take you from you," she whispered. "That's what I'm here for." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I won't. I promise." The weeks that followed were the happiest of his life. Quick flashes, burned into memory. Noelle quizzing him on finance vocabulary while he waited for her shift to end. Him sneaking her notes into her textbooks, terrible drawings of coffee cups with little hearts. Her falling asleep on his shoulder during a late movie night, her breathing soft and steady against his neck. Shared meals in the dining hall, laughing about terrible food. Whispered conversations in the library stacks, her hand always finding his. They were broke and exhausted, and completely, recklessly in love. "We're going to make it," Kellen told her one night, standing outside her dormitory. "Both of us. Together." She smiled up at him. I know we will. Whatever I build, wherever I go, you're coming with me. Promise. Promise. It was the kind of vow only the young make, unmarked by the knowledge that life rarely honors the contracts we write in the dark. They had no money, no connections, no guarantees, but they had each other, and for one brief shining moment, that was enough. 4 months after graduation, June, Philadelphia. The chapel was borrowed. The dress was clearance, $68 from a department store going out of business slightly. Too long in the hem, requiring safety pins at the back where the zipper didn't quite close. The ring had been purchased with 3 months of parking tips, collected, dollar by dollar, in a mason jar Kellen kept hidden under his bed. It was a 1/4-carat diamond on a thin gold band, so small you had to squint to see it catch the light. It was the most beautiful thing Noelle had ever owned. The ceremony took place on a Thursday afternoon in a community church that let couples use the space for free if they agreed to be out by 4 p.m. for choir practice. 23 guests sat in the worn wooden pews. Noelle's mother had flown in from Boston, crying before the processional even started, a handful of college friends, Kellen's roommate serving as best man, Noelle's cousin as maid of honor. Kellen's mother had sent a card, but not herself, her absence a wound he pretended didn't exist. The officiant was a retired minister who'd agreed to perform the service, as a favor to Noelle's mother, who'd cleaned his house for 6 years. None of it was fancy. All of it was perfect. Noelle walked down the aisle to a recording played from someone's phone connected to a portable speaker. Her bouquet was grocery store flowers, carnations and baby's breath, $12 total. Her shoes were borrowed from her maid of honor and pinched slightly at the toes. But when she looked at Kellen standing at the altar, his thrift store suit pressed within an inch of its life, his eyes suspiciously bright, his hands trembling just enough for her to notice. None of the imperfections mattered. They'd written their own vows. His went first. "Noelle," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. "6 months ago you spilled coffee on me and laughed about it, and somehow that was the moment my life actually started. You see me, not the person I'm trying to become, not the success I'm chasing, but me, the scared kid from a town nobody's heard of, trying to outrun his own past." He took her hands in his. "I can't promise you wealth. I can't promise you an easy life. But I can promise you this. Every single thing I build, every success I achieve, every dream I chase, it's for us, for our future. I will spend the rest of my life trying to give you the world because you already gave me everything when you agreed to share yours with me." Noelle wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smudging mascara she'd carefully applied that morning. Her turn. "Kellen," she began, "I've spent my whole life being practical, careful, making safe choices because safe choices keep you from getting hurt." She squeezed his hands. "But loving you isn't safe. It's terrifying. You dream so big it scares me sometimes. You want so much, and you work so hard, and I know you're going to do incredible things." Her voice caught. "My only prayer is that you don't forget to look up from the work long enough to see I'm still standing beside you, because I will be, always. No matter what we have or don't have, this right here, you and me, this is the only thing I need." The minister pronounced them husband and wife. Kellen kissed her like she was the only person in the room. The congregation, all 23 of them, erupted in applause. Outside the chapel, someone threw birdseed instead of rice because rice was more expensive. Photos were taken on disposable cameras because professional photographers were out of the question. The reception was held in Noelle's mother's hotel room, a Holiday Inn off the highway, with a grocery store cake, and plastic champagne flutes and more love packed into those 4 walls than most ballrooms ever contained. It was everything they could afford. It was more than enough. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that sat directly above Spin Cycle Laundromat on Chestnut Street. It was 400 square feet of questionable plumbing, radiators that clanged like percussion instruments. At 3 a.m., and walls so thin they could hear their neighbor's television through the drywall. The floor sloped slightly toward the bathroom. The windows stuck in summer and leaked in winter. The water pressure was a suggestion rather than a guarantee. It smelled perpetually and inescapably of laundry detergent. The scent rose through the floorboards from the machines below, commercial-grade Tide and fabric softener. a constant aromatic reminder of exactly how far they had to climb. On humid days, the smell intensified. On laundry-heavy weekends, when the machines ran 16 hours straight, the whole apartment practically vibrated with the rhythm of spin cycles. It was loud and cramped, and technically below housing code in at least 2 ways the landlord hoped they wouldn't notice. It was theirs. They signed the lease 3 days after the wedding, Kellen's signature. Sharp and confident, Noelle's slightly shaky from excitement. First month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit that depleted their savings entirely. They moved in with 2 suitcases, 3 cardboard boxes, and a mattress Noelle's mother had shipped from Boston because she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter sleeping on the floor. That mattress lived in the center of the living room for the first 2 months. They couldn't afford a bed frame. They bought paint instead, a gallon of pale yellow for the kitchen, a gallon of soft gray for the bedroom, and spent their first weekend as married occupants transforming the dingy walls into something that felt like home. Noelle had a steadier hand, so she did the edges. Kellen had longer arms, so he did the high spots. They met in the middle, paintbrushes dripping, laughing at the streaks they'd accidentally left on each other. "You've got yellow in your hair," he said. "You've got gray on your face. We're a mess. We're adorable." The furniture came piece by piece, scavenged from thrift stores and curb, alerts, and the occasional dumpster that yielded unexpected treasures. A kitchen table with a wobbly leg, stabilized by a folded piece of cardboard. 2 chairs that didn't match. A couch they found on the street in surprisingly good condition, which they carried up 3 flights of stairs while arguing about angles and pivot points and whether it would even fit through the door. It fit, barely. The refrigerator became a gallery of their aspirations, magazine clippings of beautiful kitchens they dreamed of someday owning, photos from the wedding, developed at a drugstore for 20 cents each, a postcard from Boston sent by Noelle's mother. "So proud of you both." Kellen's handwritten business plan outline, covered in notes and arrows and ambitious projections, and in the center, held by a magnet shaped like a coffee cup, a reminder of how they'd met, a small piece of paper with Noelle's handwriting. "Home is wherever you are." Their days fell into rhythms defined by scarcity and sustained by love. Noelle worked as a teaching assistant at a community college, grading papers, and leading discussion sections for an introductory nursing course. The pay was minimal, but the experience was valuable, and it kept her foot in the door of the career she was building. She left the apartment at 7 a.m. and often didn't return until after 6 p.m., her bags heavy with student essays that needed feedback, her mind heavy with the weight of other people's problems that she'd absorbed during office hours. Kellen was building a startup with 2 friends from college, Marcus, a tech wizard who could code anything, and Daniel, a marketing major with more charisma than sense. They called their company GridPoint Solutions, and their vision was to create software that would help small businesses manage their energy consumption more efficiently. It was a good idea. It was also, in those early months, barely functional. They worked out of Daniel's parents' basement 40 minutes outside the city, commuting on buses and borrowed cars, surviving on coffee and optimism. Kellen handled the business side, pitching to potential investors, managing what little money they had, mapping out growth strategies on whiteboards that never got erased because every inch of space contained something important. Most days he didn't get home until after 10 p.m. Most nights, Noelle was already asleep. But they carved out moments. Sunday mornings were sacred. No work, no studying, no obligations. Just the 2 of them, tangled together on the mattress in the living room, watching old movies on a laptop balanced on a cardboard box. Noelle would make coffee. She'd brought her own equipment from the grind, a parting gift from her manager, and Kellen would attempt breakfast with whatever ingredients they had. Usually, this meant eggs. Sometimes, when the grocery budget allowed, it meant pancakes. Once, memorably, it meant mac and cheese because that was literally all they had, and Noelle laughed until she cried at the sight of her husband serving boxed pasta at 9 a.m. with the solemnity of a 5-star chef. "Breakfast of champions," Kellen declared, setting the pot on their wobbly table. "This is the saddest thing I've ever seen. It's romantic. We're poor artists, struggling for our dreams. You're in finance software. I'm grading essays about blood pressure. We're not artists. We're artisans of survival." He spooned an aggressive portion onto her plate. "Eat your sodium-laden breakfast and be grateful." She was grateful for all of it. For the way he danced with her in the tiny kitchen, spinning her between the sink and the stove while the radio played songs from decades before they were born. For the way he left notes in her lunch bag, terrible drawings, worse, puns, declarations of love spelled out in the back of receipt paper. For the way he reached for her in his sleep, pulling her close even when he was unconscious, like his body couldn't bear to be apart from hers. For the way he looked at her, like she was the most important thing in the world, even when she suspected she wasn't. Late one night, the winter of their first year, they lay together on the mattress watching snow fall past the window. The radiator clanged. The laundromat hummed below. Somewhere in the building a baby was crying. "Someday," Kellen said quietly, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, "I'm going to get you a house with a kitchen bigger than this whole apartment." Noelle smiled against his chest. "Is that right? With a real dining room, and a backyard, and one of those fancy refrigerators with the water dispenser in the door. Big dreams, Mr. Armitage." "The biggest." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You deserve better than this. Than cold radiators and noisy neighbors and eating mac and cheese for dinner 3 times a week." She propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. His face was half shadowed, but his eyes caught the glow of the streetlight outside. He looked young, hungry, absolutely certain that the future he envisioned was not just possible, but inevitable. She loved that certainty. She also, in some small corner of her heart, feared it. "Kellen," she said softly, "I don't need a big kitchen. I don't need a fancy house, but I just need you, burning the mac and cheese at midnight, tripping over paint cans, complaining about the radiator." She touched his face. "This, right here. This is enough." He caught her hand, kissed her palm. "It won't always be like this," he promised. "I'm going to give you everything. You already have." He didn't seem to hear her. His eyes had drifted to the window, to the snow, to the city beyond, full of buildings he didn't own. Yet, opportunities he hadn't seized yet, a future that existed only in his relentless imagination. Noelle watched him watching the world outside, and for the first time she felt a small, cold thread of worry weave through her chest. The narrator speaks. They were happy in those early years. Genuinely, deeply, recklessly happy. The kind of happiness that comes from building something together, from facing uncertainty, with clasped hands, from believing that love is enough to weather any storm. But here's the thing about dreams. The problem with dreams is, if you're not careful, you can start to love the dream more than the person you dreamed it with. Kellen Armitage had spent his whole life hungry. Hungry for security, hungry for success, hungry for the kind of power that would ensure he never felt helpless again. That hunger had driven him to Noelle, had made him believe he could have it all. Love and success, partnership and power, the warmth of her hand in his and the cold satisfaction of watching his bank account grow. But hunger doesn't negotiate. It consumes. And the bigger his dreams grew, the less room there seemed to be for the woman who had believed in them first. She didn't see it happening. Not at first. Neither did he. The distance between them grew the way ice forms on a lake, slowly, invisibly. Until one morning you look down and realize you can't see the water anymore. By the time they noticed, it was already too late to stop. 3 years into the marriage, Philadelphia, then Manhattan. The call came on a Tuesday. Kellen was in the basement office. They'd upgraded from Daniel's parents' place to a proper co-working space, though proper was generous. When his phone rang with an unfamiliar number, he almost didn't answer. He'd been screening calls all week, dodging creditors and disappointed investors. And the landlord who wanted to know why the rent was 2 weeks late. Something made him pick up. "Mr. Armitage, this is Patricia Vance, Chief Operations Officer at Meridian Manufacturing. We've been reviewing your GridPoint software demo, and I'd like to discuss a licensing agreement." Kellen's heart stopped. Meridian Manufacturing was not a small company. They had 12 facilities across the Northeast, 4,000 employees, and an energy bill that ran into the millions annually. They were exactly the kind of client GridPoint had been designed for, and exactly the kind of client who had been ignoring their pitches for 18 months. "Of course," Kellen said, his voice remarkably steady for a man whose hands had started shaking. "I'd be happy to discuss terms." The terms, when they came, were beyond anything he'd allowed himself to hope for. A 3-year licensing deal, implementation across all 12 facilities, a number with enough zeros that Kellen had to ask Patricia to repeat it, certain he'd misheard. He hadn't misheard. The contracts were signed 2 weeks later in a conference room that smelled like expensive coffee and possibility. Kellen wore his thrift store suit, still the only one he owned, and tried not to let his hands tremble as he put pen to paper. When he walked out of that building, he was no longer a struggling entrepreneur, running a startup out of borrowed spaces and desperate optimism. He was the CEO of a company that had just secured its first major client. The dominoes fell quickly after that. Investors who'd ignored his emails suddenly wanted meetings. Tech publications that had never heard of GridPoint requested interviews. Within 6 months, they'd secured 2 more enterprise clients and a seed funding round that valued the company at $8 million. The co-working space became a real office, glass doors, a reception area, desks that didn't wobble. They hired their first employees, a developer, an accountant, an administrative assistant, who answered phones with GridPoint solutions. "How may I direct your call?" Like they were a legitimate corporation instead of 3 college friends who'd been eating ramen for dinner 6 months ago. Kellen stood in the middle of their new space on move-in day, watching workers install the company logo on the wall behind reception, and felt something he hadn't experienced since his father died. Security. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't afraid of next month's rent, wasn't calculating how many meals he could stretch from a single grocery trip, wasn't lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering if everything he'd built was about to collapse. He had made it. Or at least, he had started to. Noelle showed up at the new office on their first official day, with a box of cupcakes from the bakery down the street and a bundle of balloons that kept trying to escape through the door. "Surprise," she announced, nearly dropping everything as she wrestled with the balloon strings. "I know it's not a grand opening party, but I figured you deserved some celebration." The staff, all 4 of them, gathered around as she set up the cupcakes on the reception desk. She'd had them custom decorated, tiny fondant computers on top, GridPoint written, in blue icing, a level of effort that must have cost her half a day's salary. Kellen pulled her aside while everyone else descended on the sugar. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to." Her smile was incandescent. "I'm so proud of you, Kel. You did it. You actually did it." He kissed her forehead. "We did it. None of this would exist without you. Please, I made coffee and listened to you stress vent for 3 years. You built this. You believed in it when no one else did. That matters more than you know." She leaned into him, her head against his chest, and for a moment they stood there in the middle of his new office, surrounded by the evidence of dreams becoming reality. "This is just the beginning," he murmured into her hair. "I'm going to build something incredible. For us. For our future. I know you will. And then we'll have time. Real time. Vacations, weekends. All of it. Just let me get this off the ground and I promise." "Kellen." She pulled back to look at him. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for you to be present, right now. Today. Can you do that?" He smiled. "Absolutely." His phone buzzed. An investor wanted to move up their meeting. "I just need to take this one call," he said, already reaching for the device. 5 minutes. The call took 45. By the time he finished, Noelle had gone home. The slide was so gradual that neither of them noticed it happening. First, the 16-hour days became normal instead of exceptional. There was always another investor to court, another client to land, another crisis that required Kellen's personal attention. The company was growing faster than their infrastructure could support, and every solution created 3 new problems. He started missing things. Small things at first. A dinner reservation she'd made weeks in advance. He called from the office, apologetic, promising to make it up to her. a Sunday morning tradition abandoned because he needed to prep for a Monday presentation. A phone call from her mother, asking if he could recommend a cardiologist because she'd been having chest pains. That he returned 3 days late with a generic apology and a referral he'd had his assistant research. Then bigger things. Noelle had been taking art classes on weekends, something she'd always wanted to try, a small luxury they could finally afford. Her instructor entered one of her pieces in a student exhibition, a watercolor of the view from their apartment window that captured the way the city looked at dusk, all soft edges and fading light. She told Kellen about the exhibition a month in advance, put it on their shared calendar, reminded him twice, texted him the morning of. He didn't show. Emergency board call, he explained when he got home that night, finding her sitting in the dark living room, still in the dress she'd worn to the gallery. Patterson threatened to pull his funding if we didn't address his concerns immediately. I couldn't just... The exhibition was 3 hours, Kellen. 3 hours. I know, and I'm sorry, but the company comes first. Her voice was flat. It always comes first now. That's not fair, isn't it? He didn't have an answer. The gifts started arriving. A diamond pendant to apologize for the missed exhibition, a designer handbag after he forgot their anniversary, earrings when he canceled their vacation, a bracelet when he skipped her mother's birthday dinner. Each box arrived with a card. Each card contained variations of the same message. I'm sorry. I'll do better. I love you. Noelle lined them up on her dresser, these tokens of his absence, these beautiful substitutes for the man she'd married. One evening, after yet another dinner eaten alone while he stayed, late at the office, she sat on their bed. They had a real bed frame. Now, in a real apartment, in a building that didn't smell like laundry detergent, and stared at the collection of apology gifts. When Kellen came home at midnight, he found her holding the bracelet, turning it over in her hands. Do you like it? He asked, hopeful. The jeweler said it's one of their most popular pieces. I don't want to be bought, Kel. The words hung in the air between them. What? All of this? She gestured at the dresser, at the accumulated evidence of his guilt. The necklace, the bags, the jewelry. I don't want any of it. I'm trying to show you I care. Then, show up. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested she'd been crying long before he arrived. I don't need diamonds. I need you, present, here. Not your assistant ordering apologies on your behalf. It's not like that. Then what is it like? He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The company is at a critical stage. We're about to close our series of funding. If I don't... There's always a critical stage. Her voice cracked. There's always a closing, a deal, a crisis. When does it end? Once the company stabilizes. You said that last year. I know, but... And the year before that. Noelle. When? Kellen. She was crying now, tears sliding down her cheeks. When will you have enough? When will the company be stable enough, successful enough, big enough, that you can finally look up and see that your wife is drowning? He reached for her. She pulled away. You have me, he said quietly. You'll always have me. Just let me get through this next phase, and then what? Another phase? Another emergency? Another year of eating dinner alone while you save the company from whatever disaster is happening this week? It won't always be like this. You keep saying that. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm starting to wonder if you actually believe it, or if you just like the way it sounds. Have you ever felt like you were becoming a line item on someone else's calendar instead of a priority in their life? Like your presence was noted, scheduled, occasionally acknowledged, but never truly wanted? That's what Noelle felt, watching her husband build an empire one late night at a time. She didn't hate his success. She'd celebrated it, supported it, believed in it when it was nothing but a business plan on their refrigerator door. What she hated was the way it consumed him, the way his eyes went distant mid-conversation, already calculating his next move, the way he said, I love you, like it was a task to complete rather than a truth to feel. She was becoming a box to check, and no amount of diamonds could make that hurt less. The montage of their diverging lives, him, hunched over his desk at 11 p.m., office lights the only ones still on in the building. Her, eating takeout at their kitchen table, an empty chair across from her. Him, shaking hands with investors in expensive restaurants. Her, declining invitations from friends because she was tired of explaining why her husband couldn't make it. Him, watching his company's valuation climb on a screen, allowing himself a rare smile of satisfaction. Her, finding another "sorry I missed dinner" note on the counter, the handwriting increasingly hurried, the words increasingly hollow. Him, becoming someone she barely recognized. Her, becoming someone she never wanted to be. The distance between them grew in inches and silences, in missed moments and broken promises. In the slow accumulation of resentment that neither of them knew how to name. They were still married. They were no longer partners, and neither of them knew how to find their way back. 3 years into the marriage, Philadelphia, then Manhattan. The call came on a Tuesday. Kellen was in the basement office. They'd upgraded from Daniel's parents' place to a proper co-working space, though proper was generous. When his phone rang with an unfamiliar number, he almost didn't answer. He'd been screening calls all week, dodging creditors and disappointed investors, and the landlord, who wanted to know why the rent was 2 weeks late. Something made him pick up. "Mr. Armitage? This is Patricia Vance, Chief Operations Officer at Meridian Manufacturing. We've been reviewing your GridPoint software demo, and I'd like to discuss a licensing agreement." Kellen's heart stopped. Meridian Manufacturing was not a small company. They had 12 facilities across the Northeast, 4,000 employees, and an energy bill that ran into the millions annually. They were exactly the kind of client GridPoint had been designed for, and exactly the kind of client who had been ignoring their pitches for 18 months. "Of course," Kellen said, his voice remarkably steady for a man whose hands had started shaking. "I'd be happy to discuss terms." The terms, when they came, were beyond anything he'd allowed himself to hope for. A 3-year licensing deal, implementation across all 12 facilities, a number with enough zeros that Kellen had to ask Patricia to repeat it, certain he'd misheard. He hadn't misheard. The contracts were signed 2 weeks later in a conference room that smelled like expensive coffee and possibility. Kellen wore his thrift store suit, still the only one he owned, and tried not to let his hands tremble as he put pen to paper. When he walked out of that building, he was no longer a struggling entrepreneur, running a startup out of borrowed spaces and desperate optimism. He was the CEO of a company that had just secured its first major client. The dominoes fell quickly after that. Investors who'd ignored his emails suddenly wanted meetings. Tech publications that had never heard of GridPoint requested interviews. Within 6 months, they'd secured 2 more enterprise clients and a seed funding round that valued the company at $8 million. The co-working space became a real office. Glass doors, a reception area, desks that didn't wobble. They hired their first employees, a developer, an accountant, an administrative assistant. Who answered phones with GridPoint solutions? "How may I direct your call?" Like they were a legitimate corporation instead of 3 college friends who'd been eating ramen for dinner 6 months ago. Kellen stood in the middle of their new space on move-in day, watching workers install the company logo on the wall behind reception, and felt something he hadn't experienced since his father died. Security. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't afraid of next month's rent. Wasn't calculating how many meals he could stretch from a single grocery trip. Wasn't lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering if everything he'd built was about to collapse. He had made it. Or at least he had started to. Noel showed up at the new office on their first official day, with a box of cupcakes from the bakery down the street and a bundle of balloons that kept trying to escape through the door. "Surprise," she announced, nearly dropping everything as she wrestled with the balloon strings. "I know it's not a grand opening party, but I figured you deserve some celebration." The staff, all 4 of them, gathered around as she set up the cupcakes on the reception desk. She'd had them custom decorated, tiny fondant computers on top, GridPoint written. In blue icing, a level of effort that must have cost her half a day's salary. Kellen pulled her aside while everyone else descended on the sugar. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to." Her smile was incandescent. "I'm so proud of you, Kel. You did it. You actually did it." He kissed her forehead. "We did it. None of this would exist without you. Please. I made coffee and listened to you stress vent for 3 years. You built this. You believed in it when no one else did. That matters more than you know." She leaned into him, her head against his chest, and for a moment they stood there in the middle of his new office, surrounded by the evidence of dreams becoming reality. "This is just the beginning," he murmured into her hair. "I'm going to build something incredible. For us, for our future. I know you will. And then we'll have time. Real time, vacations, weekends, all of it. Just let me get this off the ground and I promise." "Kellen," she pulled back to look at him. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for you to be present, right now, today. Can you do that?" He smiled. "Absolutely." His phone buzzed. An investor wanted to move up their meeting. "I just need to take this one call," he said, already reaching for the device. 5 minutes. The call took 45. By the time he finished, Noelle had gone home. The slide was so gradual that neither of them noticed it happening. First, the 16-hour days became normal instead of exceptional. There was always another investor to court, another client to land, another crisis that required Kellen's personal attention. The company was growing faster than their infrastructure could support, and every solution created 3 new problems. He started missing things, small things, at first. A dinner reservation she'd made weeks in advance. He called from the office apologetic, promising to make it up to her. A Sunday morning tradition abandoned because he needed to prep for a Monday presentation. A phone call from her mother, asking if he could recommend a cardiologist because she'd been having chest pains. That he returned 3 days late with a generic apology, and a referral he'd had his assistant research. Then bigger things. Noelle had been taking art classes on weekends, something she'd always wanted to try, a small luxury they could finally afford. Her instructor entered one of her pieces in a student exhibition, a watercolor of the view from their apartment window that captured the way the city looked at dusk, all soft edges and fading light. She told Kellen about the exhibition a month in advance, put it on their shared calendar, reminded him twice, texted him the morning of. He didn't show. Emergency board call, he explained when he got home that night, finding her, sitting in the dark living room, still in the dress she'd worn to the gallery. Patterson threatened to pull his funding if we didn't address his concerns immediately. I couldn't just. The exhibition was 3 hours, Kellen. 3 hours. I know, and I'm sorry, but the company comes first. Her voice was flat. It always comes first now. That's not fair, isn't it? He didn't have an answer. The gifts started arriving. A diamond pendant to apologize for the missed exhibition. A designer handbag after he forgot their anniversary. Earrings when he canceled their vacation. A bracelet when he skipped her mother's birthday dinner. Each box arrived with a card. Each card contained variations of the same message. I'm sorry. I'll do better. I love you. Noelle lined them up on her dresser, these tokens of his absence, these beautiful substitutes for the man she'd married. One evening, after yet another dinner eaten alone while he stayed, late at the office she sat on their bed. They had a real bed frame. Now in a real apartment, in a building that didn't smell like laundry detergent, and stared at the collection of apology gifts. When Kellen came home at midnight, he found her holding the bracelet, turning it over in her hands. Do you like it? He asked, hopeful. The jeweler said it's one of their most popular pieces. I don't want to be bought, Kel. The words hung in the air between them. What? All of this? She gestured at the dresser, at the accumulated evidence of his guilt. The necklace, the bags, the jewelry. I don't want any of it. I'm trying to show you I care. Then show up. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested she'd been crying long before he arrived. I don't need diamonds. I need you. Present. Here. Not your assistant ordering apologies on your behalf. It's not like that. Then what is it like? He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The company is at a critical stage. We're about to close our series of funding. If I don't, there's always a critical stage. Her voice cracked. There's always a closing, a deal, a crisis. When does it end? Once the company stabilizes. You said that last year. I know, but... And the year before that, Noelle. When, Kellen? She was crying now, tears sliding down her cheeks. When will you have enough? When will the company be stable enough, successful enough, big enough, that you can finally look up and see that your wife is drowning? He reached for her. She pulled away. You have me, he said quietly. You'll always have me. Just let me get through this next phase, and then what? Another phase? Another emergency? Another year of eating dinner alone while you save the company from whatever disaster is happening this week? It won't always be like this. You keep saying that. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm starting to wonder if you actually believe it, or if you just like the way it sounds. Have you ever felt like you were becoming a line item on someone else's calendar instead of a priority in their life? Like your presence was noted, scheduled, occasionally acknowledged, but never truly wanted? That's what Noelle felt, watching her husband build an empire one late night at a time. She didn't hate his success. She'd celebrated it, supported it, believed in it when it was nothing but a business plan on their refrigerator door. What she hated was the way it consumed him, the way his eyes went distant mid-conversation, already calculating his next move. The way he said I love you like it was a task to complete rather than a truth to feel. She was becoming a box to check, and no amount of diamonds could make that hurt less. The montage of their diverging lives, him, hunched over his desk at 11 p.m., office lights the only ones still on in the building. Her, eating takeout at their kitchen table, an empty chair across from her. Him, shaking hands with investors in expensive restaurants. Her, declining invitations from friends because she was tired of explaining why her husband couldn't make it. Him, watching his company's valuation climb on a screen, allowing himself a rare smile of satisfaction. Her finding another sorry I missed dinner note on the counter, the handwriting increasingly hurried, the words increasingly hollow. Him, becoming someone she barely recognized. Her, becoming someone she never wanted to be. The distance between them grew in inches and silences, in missed moments and broken promises. In the slow accumulation of resentment that neither of them knew how to name. They were still married, they were no longer partners, and neither of them knew how to find their way back. 4 years into the marriage Manhattan, the nausea started on a Monday. Noelle blamed the leftover Thai food she'd eaten the night before, questionable shrimp, probably sitting in the fridge a day too long. She took 2 antacids, drank ginger tea, and forced herself through her shift at the clinic where she now worked as a registered nurse. By Wednesday, the nausea hadn't faded. By Friday, it had brought a friend, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. She was tired in a way that felt cellular, like her body was running a program she hadn't authorized. Stress, she told herself. The clinic had been understaffed for weeks. She'd been picking up extra shifts to cover for colleagues on vacation. Between the long hours and the empty apartment she came home to most nights, it made sense that her body was protesting. But somewhere beneath the rational explanations, a quieter voice whispered a different possibility. She ignored it for 6 more days. On a Thursday evening, with Kellen working late, always working late, she stopped at a pharmacy on her way home. The fluorescent aisles felt too bright, the walk to the family planning section felt too long, and her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a pregnancy test and carried it to the register. The cashier didn't even look up. Noelle paid with cash, like it was something to hide. The bathroom in their new apartment was nicer than anything she'd grown up with. Marble countertops, a rainfall showerhead, heated floors that Kellen had insisted on because he'd read somewhere that it increased property value. It was the kind of bathroom that belonged in a magazine, sleek and expensive and utterly impersonal. She sat on the closed toilet lid, the test face down on the counter, her phone timer counting down 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. What would she do if it was positive? What would she do if it wasn't? She didn't know which answer scared her more. The timer chimed. Noelle picked up the test with hands that had steadied countless 4S, administered medication to dying patients, held the fingers of strangers in their worst moments. Those hands were shaking now. 2 lines. She stared at them until her vision blurred. 2 lines, unmistakable, clear as a verdict, pregnant. The word echoed through her mind, rearranging everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her future. She was going to be a mother. There was a life growing inside her, half Kellen, a tiny collection of cells that would become a person with his jaw and her eyes, his determination and her compassion, a child born from the love they'd built in that cramped apartment above the laundromat when they had nothing but each other. A sob escaped her throat. Then a laugh. Then another sob. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, still impossibly flat, still showing no sign of the miracle it contained. "Hi," she whispered. "I don't know if you can hear me yet. Probably not. But I'm your mom, and I love you already. I love you so much." The tears came faster now, but they were good tears. Clean tears. For the first time in months, Noelle felt something other than lonely. She felt chosen. She planned the reveal for Saturday. Kellen had actually promised, not just vaguely agreed, to be home by 7. No meetings, no calls, just the two of them, a rare evening carved out of his impossible schedule. Noelle spent the afternoon cooking his favorite meal, her mother's recipe for braised short ribs, passed down through 3 generations, requiring 6 hours of slow preparation. She'd never made it before. It was labor-intensive, the kind of cooking that demanded attention and patience. But today she had both. Today she had a reason. She set the table with cloth napkins they'd received as a wedding gift and never used. She found candles at the dollar store, cheap but functional, their flames casting warm shadows across the walls. She wore the dress he'd always loved, dark green silk that made her feel beautiful even when she didn't believe it. By 6:45, the apartment smelled like rosemary and red wine and possibility. By 7:30, the candles had burned down an inch, and Kellen hadn't arrived. By 8:15, the short ribs were cold, and her phone buzzed with a text. "Running late. Big presentation tomorrow. Need to finalize the deck. Don't wait up." Noelle read the message 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something different, something better. They didn't. She considered responding, considered begging him to come home, telling him it was important, revealing the secret. Through a screen, because at least then he would know, even if the moment was ruined. Instead, she typed, "Okay." She blew out the candles. She wrapped the short ribs in foil. She changed out of the green dress and into sweatpants, and she sat on the couch in the dark living room, watching the city lights through their floor-to-ceiling windows, and she waited. He came home at midnight. Noelle heard his key in the lock, heard him drop his briefcase by the door, heard his footsteps pause when he noticed her sitting in the darkness. "Hey." His voice was exhausted, surprised. "Why are you still up?" "I needed to talk to you. Can it wait until morning? I'm completely wiped, and I've got to be in by 6 to prep for—" "It can't wait." Something in her tone made him stop. He crossed to the couch, sat down beside her, and for the first time in weeks, actually looked at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." She took a breath. "I need a minute. Just 1 minute of your full attention. Can you give me that?" He silenced his phone without being asked, a gesture so rare it almost made her cry. "You have it." Noelle reached for his hand. His fingers were cold from the November air outside, his grip distracted even now. She guided his palm to her stomach, pressed it flat against the fabric of her sweatshirt, and held it there. He looked confused. "Noelle, what?" "We're having a baby. Kel." The words hung between them like a held breath. She watched his face cycle through emotions in real time, confusion giving way to comprehension, comprehension giving way to a flash of pure, unguarded joy. The kind of joy she remembered from their wedding day, from their first apartment, from a version of him that felt increasingly like a stranger. For one beautiful second, he was the man she'd married. Then the joy flickered, dimmed, was replaced by something that looked horribly like calculation. "Now?" he said. One word, just one word, but it landed like a blow. "What do you mean now?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I mean—" He pulled his hand back from her stomach, ran it through his hair. "The timing, Noelle. We're in the middle of the Series B raise. The company is at a critical juncture. If investors find out I'm about to have a kid, They might think I'm distracted, uncommitted. Uncommitted? She stood up, suddenly unable to be close to him. I just told you we're having a baby. A baby, Kellen, our baby. And your first thought is about investor optics? That's not what That's exactly what you said. I'm happy. He stood too, reaching for her. I am. This is amazing news. I just need to think about how to manage. Manage? The word tasted like poison. This isn't a PR crisis. This is our child. I know that. Do you? They stood facing each other across the coffee table, the distance between them feeling wider than the few feet of hardwood suggested. Outside, the city hummed with indifference. Inside, something fragile was beginning to crack. The company is our future, Kellen said quietly. Everything I'm building, it's for us, for our family. If I don't secure this funding, no. Noelle's hand moved to her stomach, protective, instinctive. This is our future. Right here, growing inside me. This is what matters. Both things can matter. Can they? Because every time I ask you to choose between me and the company wins. Every single time. That's not fair. It's not meant to be fair. It's meant to be true. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved. Kellen's phone buzzed on the couch where he'd left it. He didn't move to check it, but his eyes flicked toward the sound, and Noelle felt something inside her go cold. Even now, even in this moment, the company was calling. I'm going to bed, she said quietly. Noelle, I can't do this tonight. I can't fight about whether our child is convenient enough to fit into your business plan. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. That's what I thought. She turned toward the bedroom. Sleep on the couch. I need space. She lay in their bed alone, one hand pressed against her stomach, trying to focus on the miracle instead of the disappointment. I love you, she told the life inside her. Even if your father doesn't know how to show it yet, I love you enough for both of us. But the voice in her head, the one she'd been trying to silence for months, wouldn't stop whispering. Second place. You'll always be second place. And now your child will be too. She cried herself to sleep, and in the living room, Kellen sat in the darkness staring at his phone trying to convince himself that he could have everything. The company, the family, the life he'd promised her, without having to choose. He was wrong. But he wouldn't know that for a very long time. 5 months into the pregnancy Manhattan, the prenatal appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Noelle had chosen the date with surgical precision. She'd checked Kellen's calendar, the shared one his assistant maintained, color-coded by priority level, and found a rare white space. No investor meetings, no board calls, no client dinners, just a blank afternoon that seemed almost miraculous in its emptiness. She'd texted him 3 days before. Baby's first ultrasound Tuesday at 2, Dr. Reeves at Metropolitan. Can you come? His response had been immediate, a thumbs-up emoji. She'd stared at that emoji for a long time trying to decode it. Was it enthusiasm? Acknowledgement? A reflexive gesture made while his attention was elsewhere? There was no way to know. The thumbs up could mean anything or nothing. But he'd confirmed. That was what mattered. She'd sent a reminder the night before. Another thumbs up. She'd texted again that morning just to be safe. Leaving for the appointment now. See you there? 3 dots appeared, indicating he was typing. Then they vanished. No response came. The waiting room at Dr. Reeves's office was designed to be soothing. Soft lighting, neutral colors, magazines about parenting fanned across coffee tables. Instrumental music played at a volume meant to calm anxious mothers. It wasn't working. Noelle sat in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the other couples in the room. A young pair across from her, barely out of college, the husband holding his wife's hand like she might float away if he let go. An older couple by the door, clearly on their 2nd or 3rd child, comfortable in the routine of it all. A nervous father to be pacing by the reception desk, checking his watch, asking how much longer. Every pregnant woman in the room had someone beside her, except Noelle. She checked her phone. 1:58 p.m. Maybe he was running late. Maybe he was parking. Maybe traffic had been worse than expected, and he was sprinting through the lobby right now, apologetic and breathless. 2 p.m. The nurse called her name. "Mrs. Armitage, we're ready for you." Noelle looked at the door, willed it to open, prayed for the sound of footsteps, the flash of his familiar face. The door stayed closed. "Mrs. Armitage? I'm coming." Her voice sounded hollow. I thought someone was meeting me." The nurse's expression softened with the particular sympathy of someone who had seen this before. "Would you like to wait a few more minutes?" "Yes," her heart screamed. "Yes, let me wait. Let me believe he's coming. Let me pretend this marriage is something other than what it's become." "No," she said instead. "Let's go ahead." The ultrasound room was dim and clinical, the equipment humming with quiet purpose. Noelle lay on the examination table, her shirt pulled up to expose her rounded belly, gel cold against her skin. Dr. Reeves, a kind woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and steady hands, maneuvered the transducer across her abdomen. "Let's see what we've got here," Dr. Reeves murmured, her eyes on the monitor. The image swam into focus, gray and black and white, shapes that meant nothing to an untrained eye but everything to a mother's heart. And then, the sound, a rapid rhythmic whooshing, like galloping horses or distant thunder or the most beautiful music ever composed. The baby's heartbeat, strong and steady, filling the room with proof of life. Noelle's composure shattered. The tears came without permission, sliding down her temples and into her hair, her chest heaving with the effort of containing a sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to muffle the sound, trying to be dignified, but there was no dignity. In this moment, only grief and love, and the devastating absence of the man who should have been holding her hand. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Reeves said gently, pretending not to notice the breakdown happening on her table. "Strong heartbeat, good development. Would you like to know the sex?" Noelle nodded, not trusting her voice. "It's a boy. A boy." She was having a son. His son. A child with his determination and her heart, who would grow up asking why Daddy wasn't at the ultrasound, why Daddy worked so late, why Daddy's phone was more important than bedtime stories. Or maybe he wouldn't ask at all. Maybe he'd just learn not to expect anything. "Can the first?" Noelle swallowed hard. "Can I have a picture of the ultrasound?" "Of course, Doctor." Reeves smiled. "I'll print several. One for you, one for the frame, and one for Dad when he gets a chance to see it." If he gets a chance, Noelle thought. If he ever makes the time. She was sitting on the couch when Kellen came home that night, the ultrasound photo clutched in her hands. She'd been staring at it for hours, memorizing the curve of the tiny spine, the suggestion of fingers, the impossible reality of a life growing inside her. He walked through the door at 9:47 p.m., loosening his tie, already reaching for his phone to check something. "Hey," he said absently, "how was your day?" The question was so casual, so utterly divorced from the magnitude of what had happened, that Noelle almost laughed. "You missed it," she said instead. He paused, looked up. Something flickered across his face, confusion, then recognition, then the particular expression of a man who knows he's about to be held accountable for a failure he'd rather forget. "The appointment." He set his briefcase down slowly. "Noelle, I'm so sorry. The board meeting ran long, and then Harrison needed to discuss the quarterly projections, and I sat in that waiting room." Her voice was terrifyingly calm, surrounded by couples, husbands holding their wives' hands, fathers crying when they heard their baby's heartbeat for the first time. "I know, and I heard our son's heartbeat alone, Kellen." "Alone, son?" The word seemed to catch him off guard. "It's a boy?" She held up the ultrasound photo. Even from across the room, the grainy image was unmistakable. A baby, their baby, suspended in the darkness of her womb. "I found out without you. Because you weren't there. Because you're never there." He moved toward her, reaching for the photo. "Let me see." She pulled it back. "You don't get to see it like this. Like it's a report someone forgot to file. Like it's something you can catch up on between meetings. That's not fair." "Fair?" The calm cracked. "You want to talk about fair? I've spent the last 4 years supporting your dreams, Kellen. Eating alone, sleeping alone, explaining to everyone why my husband can't make it to anything. And the one time I asked you to show up for something that mattered to me, to us, to our family, you couldn't even do that. The board meeting was unavoidable. Everything is unavoidable. She was standing now, the photo crumpled in her fist. Every meeting, every call, every emergency that isn't really an emergency, but gets treated like one because the company always comes first. The company is how I provide for this family. I don't need you to provide. I need you to be present. I need you to look at me like I'm more than an item on your to-do list that keeps getting pushed to tomorrow. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He glanced at it. Just for a second. Just a flicker of his eyes toward the sound. An instinct so ingrained he probably didn't even realize he'd done it. But Noelle saw. "Go ahead," she said quietly, all the fight draining from her voice. "Answer it. I know you want to. I'm not going to." "You already did. In your head you already did. You're standing here, pretending to listen to me, and part of you is wondering what's happening at the office. Who needs you? What crisis is demanding your attention? That's not true. Look me in the eye and tell me you weren't thinking about that call." He couldn't. The silence stretched between them, damning and absolute. "I won't beg you to choose us anymore," Noelle said. "I've been begging for years, and I'm done. I can't keep competing with a company that will always need you more than I'm allowed to. You're being dramatic." The word hit like a slap. "Dramatic." She repeated it slowly, tasting its cruelty. "I'm being dramatic. My husband missed the first ultrasound of our child, and I'm being dramatic. I didn't mean. You called me lonely last month. Remember that? When I asked you to take a weekend off, and you said I was being lonely and clingy, like wanting to spend time with my husband was some kind of pathology. I was stressed. I said things I didn't mean. You meant them. You just wish you hadn't said them out loud." He had no response. "I think," Noelle said carefully, "that you love me. Somewhere, under all the meetings and the deals, and the constant need to prove yourself, I think you love me. But I don't think you know how to show it anymore, and I don't think you're willing to learn." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't live like this anymore. I can't raise a child with a ghost." He slept on the couch again that night. Or tried to. Mostly he stared at the ceiling, replaying the argument, cataloging his failures, searching for the words that might fix what he'd broken. He couldn't find them. Noelle sat at the kitchen table, still wobbly even after all these years, and wrote. The letter poured out of her in the dark hours, everything she couldn't say out loud finding its way onto paper. She wrote about the baby, about her fears, about the dreams they'd shared in that apartment above the laundromat, when they had nothing but believed they could build everything. She wrote about still loving him, about always loving him probably, no matter how this ended. And she wrote the boundaries she should have set years ago. "Come find us when you're ready to be a husband and a father, not just a provider. When you can look at our son and see more than an inconvenience. When you can look at me and see the woman you promised to cherish, not the wife you forgot along the way. I'll wait. But I won't wait here. I love you. I'm sorry that wasn't enough. Noelle." She folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote his name on the front. Then she slipped her wedding ring off her finger, the quarter-carat diamond that had once been the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned, and set it on top of the envelope beside the coffee maker. He would see it in the morning. He would read the letter. He would understand. And maybe, just maybe, the shock would finally wake him up. Morning came gray and cold. Kellen's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. He had an early meeting, always. An early meeting, and he stumbled through the apartment on autopilot. Shower, shave, suit, coffee. He was reaching for the coffee maker when he saw the ring. His heart stopped. He grabbed the envelope, tore it open. Empty. He searched the counter, the floor, the trash can. Nothing. No letter. No explanation. Just the ring sitting there like a period at the end of a sentence he hadn't read. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his assistant Miranda had arrived 20 minutes earlier to drop off documents he'd requested. She'd seen the envelope on the counter assumed it was outgoing mail, and tucked it into her bag with the other correspondence to be sorted at the office. She was efficient like that. Thorough. She filed the envelope with the rest of the week's mail, stacks of investor letters, legal documents, unsolicited pitches, and never thought about it again. Noelle's words disappeared into a pile of paper that would eventually be archived, boxed, and forgotten. The letter that explained everything was never read. Kellen came home that night to an empty apartment. Her clothes were gone. Her photos were gone. The ultrasound picture had vanished from wherever she'd hidden it. All that remained was the ring. And the silence. If you were in Noelle's position, would you have left too, or tried to stay and fight it out? Tell me in the comments, because your perspective might help someone else watching this right now. This story isn't just entertainment. It's a mirror. And sometimes we need to see ourselves reflected in someone else's choices to understand our own. And if you're finding yourself pulled into this story, if you're wondering what happens when their paths cross again years later, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's coming next will change everything. Kellen lost his wife that day, but he was about to lose something else, something he didn't even know existed. His son. The day she left somewhere between Manhattan and Massachusetts, the bus smelled like diesel and regret. Noelle sat in a window seat near the back, her backpack clutched on her lap, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where her son, their son, grew oblivious to the destruction of the world he would be born into. The seat fabric was threadbare, stained with the journeys of 1,000 strangers, who had also been running from something or towards something or simply away. Outside the window, Manhattan's skyline shrank into the distance, its towers catching the morning light like monuments to ambition. Somewhere in one of those glass buildings, Kellen was probably in a meeting, probably checking his phone, probably not yet aware that his wife had vanished and his future had changed forever. She wondered how long it would take him to notice. Hours. Days? Would he even look for her? The questions circled her mind like vultures, but she forced herself to stop feeding them. What Kellen did or didn't do was no longer her concern. She had made her choice. She had written her explanation. She had left the ring as a symbol of everything she was surrendering and everything she was refusing to sacrifice. Now all that remained was forward. The bus lurched through Connecticut, then Rhode Island, the urban sprawl gradually, giving way to stretches of highway lined with trees turning gold and orange. Fall in New England. She'd almost forgotten how beautiful it could be, how the world could feel like it was ending and beginning at the same time. 4 hours into the journey, her phone buzzed. Kellen's name on the screen. She stared at it for 3 rings, 4, 5. Her thumb hovered over the answer button, trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. She let it go to voicemail. Then she powered the phone off and slid it to the bottom of her backpack, beneath the clothes and the cash and the ultrasound photo she couldn't bear to leave behind. Some conversations required distance, some required years. Rockport, Massachusetts was the kind of town that tourists visited in summer and forgot about by winter. Population, 8,000. One main street lined with art galleries and seafood restaurants. A harbor full of fishing boats that had seen better decades. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed, but not necessarily unwelcome. Noelle's mother, June Chen, had moved there 5 years ago after retiring from her housekeeping jobs in Boston. She'd bought a tiny cottage 3 blocks from the water with money she'd saved dollar by dollar over 30 years of cleaning other people's homes. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled permanently of ginger and soy sauce, and a garden where she grew vegetables that never quite thrived in the salt air. It was modest. It was safe. It was the only place Noelle could think to go. June was waiting on the porch when the bus dropped Noelle at the Rockport station, a converted gas station that served as the town's unofficial transportation hub. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply opened her arms, and Noelle walked into them and cried for the first time since leaving Manhattan. "I know," June murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "I know, baby. You're home now." The first months were hard in ways Noelle hadn't anticipated. Morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon. feet so swollen by evening that her shoes no longer fit. The constant gnawing anxiety about money, how much she had, how long it would last, what she would do when it ran out. She found a job at a roadside diner called the Salt Shaker, working the breakfast and lunch shifts because those were the hours she could manage before exhaustion claimed her. The uniform was unflattering, the tips were inconsistent, and her back ached from carrying trays while carrying a child. But the owner, a gruff woman named Margie who had raised 4 kids on her own, let Noelle sit during slow periods and never commented when she needed extra bathroom breaks. "Been where you are," Margie said one afternoon, watching Noelle rub her lower back. "Thought I'd break in half some days." "But you don't. Women don't break. We bend." Noelle wanted to believe that. Late at night, lying in her childhood bedroom, June had given her the larger room, insisting she needed space for the baby. She counted the money in her savings account and calculated how many months of diapers and formula it would buy. The numbers never added up to enough. They never did. But every time despair crept close, she would feel the baby move. A kick. A flutter. A reminder that she wasn't alone, would never be alone again, that whatever came next, she would face it with her son by her side. June Chen had never been a woman of many words, but the words she offered carried weight. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the harbor, when Noelle finally spoke about Kellen, about the marriage, about why she'd left. June listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. When Noelle finished, her mother was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to hate him," June said finally. "Hate takes energy. Energy you need for other things now. I don't hate him." The admission surprised Noelle. "I think that's the worst part. I still love him. I just couldn't live with him anymore. Those aren't the same thing." "Took me years to understand that about your father." Noelle looked at her mother, really looked, and saw the decades of accumulated wisdom written in the lines of her face. One day, June continued, "You'll have to decide which hurts less, holding on to anger or letting it go. Neither one is easy, but one of them lets you move forward. What if I can't let it go? Then you carry it, until you can't anymore, until the weight of it gets heavier than the fear of setting it down." June reached over and took her daughter's hand. "That boy in your belly is going to have questions someday, about his father, about why things are the way they are, and when that day comes, you're going to have to decide what story you tell him. The angry one or the true one. What if they're the same story? They never are, baby. They never are." Rowan James Chen was born on a rainy morning in March. Noelle had chosen not to give him Kellen's last name, a decision that felt like protection and punishment in equal measure. Chen was her mother's name, her heritage, a lineage of strong women who had survived worse than heartbreak. The labor lasted 14 hours. June held her hand through all of it, coaching her through contractions, wiping sweat from her forehead, whispering encouragement when Noelle was certain she couldn't push anymore. And then, at 6:47 a.m., he arrived. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes. A shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his presence to the entire maternity ward. The nurse placed him on Noelle's chest, and the world stopped. He was so small, so impossibly, terrifyingly small. His eyes were squeezed shut, his fists clenched, his mouth searching instinctively for something he couldn't name. Noelle looked at his face and saw Kellen's jawline, that stubborn set of bone that would probably serve him well someday, and her own eyes, dark and deep and full of questions. "Hi," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hi, Rowan. I'm your mom." He opened his eyes. In that moment, every sacrifice she'd made felt worth it. Every mile she'd traveled, every tear she'd cried, every sleepless night of worry, all of it, collapsed into this single point of contact, this tiny human who depended on her completely. "I've got you," she promised. "Whatever happens, however hard it gets, I've got you, always." The early years passed in a blur of exhaustion and grace. Crying nights when nothing would soothe him, pacing the cottage floor at 3 a.m., convinced she was failing, only to have him finally settle against her shoulder with a sigh that broke her heart. Stacks of unpaid bills organized by urgency, juggled with a precision that bordered on artistry. Rent first, utilities second, everything else negotiable. But also, Rowan sleeping on her chest, his breath warm and even, his tiny hand curled around her finger like she was his anchor to the world. His first steps taken on the beach, sand between his toes, squealing with delight as the waves chased him. His first word, mama, spoken on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable, except for the way it rewrote her entire understanding of love. She kept the wedding ring. She couldn't bring herself to sell it or throw it away. It was proof that what she'd had with Kellen had been real. That Rowan wasn't born from nothing but from a love that had once been genuine, even if it had failed. She wore it on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her shirt, close to her heart. A secret weight she carried everywhere. The question started when Rowan was 4. They were walking home from the beach, his small hand in hers, when he looked up at her with Kellen's eyes and asked, "Mommy, where's my daddy?" Noelle's heart clenched. She'd known this moment would come, had rehearsed answers in her head 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared her for the actual weight of it. She knelt down to his level, brushing sand from his cheek. "Your daddy lives far away, sweetheart." "Why?" "Because sometimes grown-ups make choices that are hard to explain, and sometimes people who love each other can't live together." Rowan considered this with the seriousness only a 4-year-old could muster. Did he not want me? The question shattered something inside her. She pulled him close, holding him tight, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Listen to me, Rowan. You were always wanted. You were always a gift. From the moment I knew you existed, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. But Daddy, your daddy." She pulled back to look at him. I think he was scared. Of a lot of things. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. Sometimes people get so scared of failing that they forget how to show up. Is he still scared? I don't know, baby. I hope not. Do you think he thinks about me? Noelle swallowed hard. The honest answer was, she didn't know. Kellen had never found them, never reached out, never appeared. Whether that was because he'd given up, or because the letter had explained things in a way that made him respect her boundaries, she would probably never know. "I think," she said carefully, "that somewhere out there, your daddy remembers that he has a son, and I think someday when the time is right, you might get the chance to ask him yourself." Rowan nodded slowly. Then he squeezed her hand and asked if they could get ice cream. The moment passed, but Noelle never forgot it. Telling the truth without hate is its own kind of strength. Noelle could have poisoned Rowan against his father, could have painted Kellen as a villain, fed her son a steady diet of resentment, made sure he grew up believing he'd been abandoned by a man who didn't care. She chose differently, not because Kellen deserved protection, but because Rowan deserved better than a childhood built on bitterness. She gave him the truth, incomplete, imperfect, honest. She let him form his own understanding, ask his own questions, carry his own complicated feelings about a father he'd never met. It was the hardest thing she ever did, and maybe the most important. 12 years after Noelle left Manhattan Rockport, Massachusetts, the summer Rowan turned 12, a man died in front of him. Or almost died. The distinction would matter later, when he replayed the moment in his mind 1,000 times, dissecting every second, every decision, every heartbeat that separated tragedy from survival. It was a Saturday afternoon at the Salt Shaker. The lunch rush had just ended, and the diner had settled into that lazy mid-afternoon lull where the regulars nursed coffee and the staff pretended not to be exhausted. Rowan was doing homework in his usual booth by the window. Noelle let him come to work with her on weekends, partly because childcare was expensive, and partly because she couldn't bear to be apart from him for an entire shift. He was halfway through a math problem when he heard the crash. A tourist, mid-60s, sunburned, wearing a Cape Cod t-shirt he'd probably bought that morning, had collapsed beside the register. His wife was screaming. Margie was frozen behind the counter. The other customers sat paralyzed, watching disaster unfold like it was happening on a screen rather than 3 feet away. Rowan didn't think. He moved. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain what propelled him from his booth, What override switch flipped in his brain that transformed a 12-year-old boy into someone capable of action while adults stood helpless? He only knew that he was suddenly kneeling beside the man, pressing his ear to the chest that wasn't moving, feeling for the pulse that wasn't there. CPR. He'd learned it in health class 2 months ago. Mrs. Patterson had made them practice on rubber dummies, while most of the class giggled and complained about how boring it was. Rowan had paid attention. He interlocked his fingers, positioned his hands on the man's sternum, and began compressions. 30 of them, hard and fast the way Mrs. Patterson had demonstrated. Then he tilted the man's head back, lifted his chin, pinched his nose, and breathed into his mouth. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. His arms burned. His shoulders ached. The man's wife was sobbing somewhere behind him, and someone was on the phone with 911, and Margie was saying, "Oh my God," over and over like a broken record. Rowan kept going. He was still going when the paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. They had to physically pull him away from the body, his hands cramping, his chest heaving, his face streaked with tears he didn't remember crying. "Kid." The lead EMT, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands, knelt beside him while her partner took over. "Kid, look at me." Rowan looked. "You did good. You did really good. That man's heart is beating right now because of you. Is he going to be okay? He's got a fighting chance. Because you gave him one." The ambulance left with sirens wailing. The diner emptied. Noelle arrived from the back room where she'd been handling inventory, having missed the entire incident, and found her son sitting on the floor with his back against the counter, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "Rowan?" She dropped to her knees beside him. "Baby, what happened? Are you hurt?" He shook his head slowly. "A man almost died, Mom. Right there." He pointed to the spot by the register, now marked only by an overturned chair. His heart stopped, and nobody did anything. They just stood there. "But you didn't know." He finally looked at her, and his eyes, her eyes, dark and deep, were filled with something she'd never seen before. Something that looked like purpose. "I didn't." That night, after the diner closed and the story had been told and retold to June, who cried and hugged her grandson until he complained he couldn't breathe, Rowan found Noelle on the porch. She was sitting in her usual chair, watching the stars appear one by one over the harbor. "Mom? Hey, sweetheart, can't sleep?" He sat down beside her, his legs dangling off the porch edge, his expression serious in a way that made him look older than his 12 years. "I know what I want to be when I grow up." Noelle smiled. Kids change their minds constantly. Last month he'd wanted to be a marine biologist. And before that, an astronaut. And before that, a professional video game player. She expected another addition to the ever-rotating list. "Yeah? What's that?" "A doctor." Something in his tone made her realize this wasn't like the other declarations. "What kind of doctor?" "The emergency kind. The kind that shows up when people are falling apart." He turned to look at her, and the moonlight caught the determination in his face. "I'm tired of watching people break and not being able to do anything about it. I want to be the person who fixes things, who puts people back together." Noelle's throat tightened. She knew in that moment that this wasn't a phase. This was a calling. The kind of bone-deep certainty that some people search their whole lives for and never find. Her son had found it at 12. "That's going to take a lot of work," she said carefully. "A lot of years. Medical school, residency. It's not easy." "I know. It's expensive too. We don't have—" "I'll get scholarships. I'll work. I'll figure it out." He reached over and took her hand, a gesture so tender, so adult that it nearly broke her. "You've worked your whole life to give me chances, Mom. Let me do something with them." She pulled him close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, all the sacrifice had been worth it. The years that followed were a testament to determination. Rowan threw himself into academics with an intensity that bordered on obsession. While other teenagers were discovering parties and first loves and the art of doing as little homework as possible, he was staying up until midnight with biology textbooks, memorizing anatomy, teaching himself chemistry from library books because the high school science program was underfunded. He volunteered at the community clinic on weekends, doing whatever they'd let him do, filing paperwork, restocking supplies, sitting with elderly patients who just needed someone to talk to. The doctors there noticed him, this quiet teenager who asked intelligent questions and actually listened to the answers. Dr. Marcus Webb, the clinic's director, took him under his wing. "You've got the mind for medicine," Dr. Webb told him one afternoon, "but more importantly, you've got the heart. Don't lose that." "I won't." Lots of people say that. Then they get into the system and the system grinds them down. They stop seeing patients as people and start seeing them as problems to solve. Rowan thought about the man in the diner, about the way it had felt to have a life in his hands, literally, the boundary between death and survival depending on the strength of his compressions. "I won't," he repeated, and meant it. Noel picked up extra shifts to fund his ambitions, the SAT prep courses, the AP exam, fees, the college application costs that seemed designed to keep poor kids poor. She never complained, never made him feel guilty. But Rowan saw the exhaustion in her face, the way she rubbed her feet after, double shifts, the gray beginning to thread through her dark hair. He promised himself he would pay her back someday. Not in money, she would never accept money, but in making her sacrifice mean something. His guidance counselor, a fierce woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who had sent more Rockport kids to college than anyone, in the school's history, took one look at his transcript and his story and declared him a scholarship goldmine. "Full rides," she said, spreading brochures across her desk. "That's what we're aiming for. You've got the grades, the extracurriculars, the personal narrative. We just need to package it right." They spent months on applications, essays about the diner incident, about growing up without a father, about watching his mother work herself to the bone so he could have opportunities she'd never had. Every word was true. Every sentence was calculated to open doors that had always been closed to people like them. It worked. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in April. Rowan was at school when it came, so Noel was the one who pulled it from the mailbox, who recognized the university logo in the corner, who stood in the driveway with trembling hands and a heart that had forgotten how to beat. She didn't open it. That was his moment. His victory. She wouldn't steal it from him. But she knew. Somehow she knew. When Rowan came home that afternoon, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope propped against the salt shaker, a cup of tea gone cold beside her. "Mom?" He froze in the doorway. "Is that—" "Open it." His hands shook as he tore the envelope. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second, then jumped to the financial aid section at the bottom. Full scholarship. His voice cracked. "Mom, full scholarship, tuition, housing, books, everything." Noel was crying before she reached him, pulling him into a hug that contained 18 years of struggle and sacrifice and hope finally realized. "You got out," she whispered. "Baby, you got out." He held her tighter. "We got out, both of us. Together. 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, 11 years of relentless work, of sleepless nights and impossible exams, and the constant, grinding pressure of becoming the person he'd promised himself he would be. Through it all, Noel stayed close. When Rowan moved to the city for medical school, she followed, found a job as a nurse's aide at a clinic 20 minutes from his campus, rented a small apartment that she insisted was plenty of space for one person, even though Rowan knew she did. Given up the cottage she loved, the garden she'd tended, the community she'd built over 15 years. "You didn't have to come," he told her once, helping her unpack boxes in her new place. "Yes, I did. Mom, you're my son." She said it like it explained everything. Because it did. Wherever you go, I go. That's how it works. Their bond remained tight through the years. Sunday dinners when his schedule allowed, phone calls. When it didn't, the kind of mutual respect that came from surviving hard things together. She never made him feel guilty for his absences, and he never made her feel like a burden. They had become partners in a way that transcended the usual parent-child dynamic. She was his anchor. He was her proof that sacrifice could mean something. Present day, 6 months before the Gala St. Aurelia Medical Center, Manhattan. Rowan's first day as an attending physician at St. Aurelia began at 5:30 a.m. He stood outside the hospital's main entrance, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the city that had taken everything from his mother and was now offering him everything in return. The building loomed above him, 15 stories of glass and steel and human drama, one of the most prestigious emergency medicine programs on the East Coast. He'd earned his place here, top of his residency class, published research, glowing recommendations from every attending who'd ever supervised him. St. Aurelia had recruited him personally, offering a position that hundreds of qualified candidates would have traded years of their lives for. And yet, standing there in his fresh white coat, his name embroidered over the pocket, Dr. Rowan Chen, he felt less like a conqueror and more like a supplicant. "Don't mess this up," he told himself. "People are counting on you." He thought about his mother, probably already awake in her apartment, sending good thoughts his way, even if she'd never admit to anything so sentimental. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who still sent him Christmas cards with news about former students. He thought about Dr. Webb, retired now but still sharp, who had written him a letter when he'd gotten the St. Aurelia offer. "Remember what I told you about the heart. Don't let them take it from you." He thought about his father. He didn't know why. The man was a ghost, a question mark, a void where a presence should have been. But standing on the threshold of his new life, Rowan couldn't help wondering if Kellen Armitage would be proud of what his son had become, or if he would even care. "It doesn't matter," Rowan told himself, pushing through the hospital doors. He made his choice. I made mine. But the wondering never quite went away. The ER swallowed him whole from the first moment. Traumas and overdoses and chest pains and broken bones. The full catastrophic spectrum of human vulnerability, delivered in an endless stream that paused for nothing. He moved through it with the focus his training had built, the compassion his mother had instilled, the determination. That had carried him from a roadside diner to the halls of one of America's finest hospitals. At the end of that first shift, 14 hours, 4 critical saves, 1 loss, that would haunt him for weeks, he stood in the locker room and made a vow. To every patient who trusted him with their lives. To his mother, who had given up everything for his future. To the father he'd never known, whose absence had taught him exactly who he didn't want to become. "I will never let my family feel like second place. I will never choose ambition over love. I will never become so obsessed with success that I forget what actually matters." It was a promise made in exhaustion, in the quiet aftermath of a brutal day. He had no idea how soon it would be tested. 15 years after Noel left Manhattan, the empire Kellen Armitage built was magnificent. Armitage Global Industries, the company that had started as Gridpoint Solutions in a basement, survived on ramen and desperation, and nearly died a dozen times before its first real client had become a titan. What began as energy management software had expanded into renewable infrastructure, smart grid technology, battery storage systems, and a clean energy consulting division that advised governments on 3 continents. The numbers were staggering. 42,000 employees worldwide, operations in 37 countries, annual revenue that required scientific notation to comprehend, a stock price that made early investors weep with gratitude and late investors curse their hesitation. Forbes called him the Green Giant. Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people alive. Bloomberg ran a profile titled "The Man Who Made Sustainability Profitable," complete with a photograph of Kellen. Standing on the roof of his Manhattan headquarters, the city sprawled beneath him like a kingdom awaiting orders. He had everything he'd ever wanted. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building he owned outright, 6,000 square feet, of Italian marble and floor-to-ceiling windows and art that cost more than his childhood home. The closet alone was larger than the apartment above the laundromat, filled with suits that had been hand-tailored. In Milan, watches that doubled as investment vehicles, shoes made from leather so soft it felt like wearing clouds. He had a driver, a chef, a personal assistant who managed 3 other assistants, a security detail that accompanied him everywhere, Silent men in dark suits, who scanned rooms before he entered and checked cars before he sat. He had invitations to galas and summits and private dinners where policy was shaped between courses. He had the ear of senators and CEOs and at least one head of state who called him Kel and asked his opinion on energy policy. He had achieved every goal he'd set on that rooftop with Noelle when they were young, and poor and foolish enough to believe that success and happiness were the same thing. And he had never been more alone. The women came and went like seasons. There was Victoria, the hedge fund manager, who appreciated his schedule because hers was equally brutal, until she realized that two people who never saw each other weren't really in a relationship, just strangers who occasionally shared a bed. There was Margot, the French architect who found his ambition attractive until she found it suffocating. "You are not really here," she told him the night she left, her accent making the accusation sound almost gentle. "Your body sits across from me, but your mind is always somewhere else. Always working, always planning. I cannot compete with a company, Kellen. I should not have to try." There was Diane, who lasted the longest, almost 2 years, a marketing executive, who understood corporate pressure and didn't demand more than he could give. But even she eventually reached her limit. "I asked you what you were thinking about at dinner last night," she said, packing her things. From his penthouse, with the efficiency of someone who had known this moment was coming. "You said quarterly projections. We were at our anniversary dinner, Kellen, our anniversary. And you were thinking about quarterly projections. I didn't mean, you never mean it. That's the problem. You don't even realize you're doing it anymore. The work has eaten you alive, and there's nothing left for anyone else." She paused at the door, suitcase in hand, and looked at him with something that might have been pity. Whoever she was, the woman who left the ring, she was smart to get out when she did. Before you had a chance to hollow her out completely, the door closed behind her. Kellen stood in his 6,000-square-foot penthouse, surrounded by art worth millions and furniture that had been featured in design magazines, and felt the silence press against him like a physical weight. He hired a private investigator 3 years after Noelle left, a discreet firm, recommended by his attorney, specializing in locating people who didn't want to be found. He gave them everything he had: her maiden name, her mother's address in Boston, the towns where she'd mentioned family connections. He told them to spare no expense. They found her within 6 weeks, Rockport, Massachusetts, living with her mother, working at a diner, raising a child, a son. The investigators' report included photographs, grainy surveillance shots of a small coastal town, a modest cottage, a dark-haired woman, who looked older than he remembered but still made his chest ache with recognition, and a boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old in the pictures, dark hair, strong jaw. Kellen stared at that photograph for hours. The math was simple. The timeline was obvious. The conclusion was inescapable. He had a son he'd never known about. A son who had grown from infant to child without him. A son who probably thought his father was a monster, or worse, didn't think about his father at all. He picked up the phone to call the investigator, to get more information, to plan his approach. Then he set it down. What would he say? What could he possibly say? "Sorry I missed your entire childhood. I was busy becoming a billionaire. Sorry I didn't know you existed. I was too focused on quarterly projections to notice your mother was pregnant." She had left him. She had taken off her ring and walked away without a word of explanation, at least none that he'd ever found. She had built a life without him, raised their son without him, created a world where Kellen Armitage didn't exist. Maybe that was what she wanted. Maybe that was what he deserved. He told the investigator to close the case, paid the bill, filed the report in a safe he never opened, and tried, with limited success, to pretend he'd never seen those photographs at all. The memories ambushed him at night. He'd be standing at his penthouse window, a glass of whiskey in hand, always whiskey now, the expensive kind that was supposed to taste like accomplishment but mostly tasted like anesthesia, watching the city lights spread beneath him like a circuit board. And suddenly he'd be somewhere else. The apartment above the laundromat, the smell of detergent rising through the floorboards. Noelle laughing as he burned the mac and cheese for the 3rd time that month, dancing between the sink and the stove to music playing from a phone speaker, her head against his chest, her hand in his. "I just need you burning the mac and cheese." He'd hear her voice so clearly that he'd turn, half expecting to see her standing there in the doorway of his marble kitchen. She was never there. Nobody was ever there. He'd drain the whiskey and pour another and try to remember when exactly he'd traded warmth for wealth, when the hunger that had driven him had consumed everything else, when he'd become the thing she'd always feared he'd become, a man who loved his dreams more than the person he'd dreamed them with. The answer, he suspected, was gradual. 1,000 small choices, each one reasonable in isolation, catastrophic in accumulation. He'd chosen the meeting over the dinner, the investor over the anniversary, the company over the woman, and now he had everything except the only thing that mattered. The chest pains started in his late 40s, mild at first, a tightness during stressful meetings, a shortness of breath after climbing stairs. He ignored them the way he'd ignored every inconvenient signal his body had ever sent. He was Kellen Armitage. He didn't have time to be sick. His doctor, a cardiologist recommended by his attorney because even his health required the best connections, was less dismissive. Your father died of a heart attack at what age? 43. And you're 51, with a family history of cardiac disease, a stress level that's off the charts, blood pressure that's borderline hypertensive, and a lifestyle that involves 16-hour workdays and what I suspect is more alcohol than you're admitting to. I'm managing it. You're a walking red flag, Kellen. Your heart is sending you warning signals and you're treating them like spam emails. The doctor leaned forward, his expression grave. I've seen men like you before, successful, driven, convinced they're invincible. They ignore the symptoms until the symptoms can't be ignored anymore. And by then, it's often too late. What do you recommend? Reduce your stress, delegate more. Take actual vacations, cut back on the alcohol, exercise regularly, real exercise, not walking to meetings. And for God's sake, find something to live for besides the company. Kellen nodded seriously, took the prescription for blood pressure medication, scheduled a follow-up appointment. Then he went back to the office and worked until midnight. The follow-up appointment was rescheduled 3 times before being quietly forgotten. The Armitage Heart Foundation was born in the gap between guilt and redemption. On paper, it was a philanthropic initiative, funding cardiac research, supporting underserved communities, building clinics in areas where healthcare was a luxury rather than a right. The launch garnered positive press, enhanced the company's image, and provided significant tax benefits. But Kellen knew the truth. He created the foundation because his own heart was failing, physically and otherwise. Because he couldn't save himself, but maybe he could save strangers. Because writing checks was easier than making amends. Because funding research felt like action, even when it was really avoidance. The foundation's annual gala became the social event of the season. Celebrities and politicians and business titans gathered to celebrate philanthropy, to be seen celebrating philanthropy, to write checks that would fund breakthroughs they'd never fully understand. Kellen stood at the podium each year, delivering speeches about the importance of cardiac health, the miracle of the human heart, the responsibility of the fortunate to help the less fortunate. The irony was lost on no one who knew him well. Here was a man preaching about heart health while ignoring his own symptoms. A man funding research into cardiac disease while refusing to follow his doctor's advice. A man desperate to heal hearts because he'd broken so many, including his own. How many of us try to fix our guilt with big gestures while ignoring the quiet phone calls we should be making instead? How many of us write checks to charity while owing debts to the people in our own lives? Kellen Armitage built an empire. He funded research that would save thousands of lives. He became, by every external measure, a success story for the ages. But he never picked up the phone. He never drove to Rockport. He never knocked on the door of that modest cottage and said the words he should have said 15 years ago. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I want to try again. Pride, fear, shame. The same forces that had driven him to success now held him hostage to his failures. And somewhere in that coastal town, a boy was growing into a man, forming his own opinions about the father who had never appeared. Time, as it always does, was running out. Kellen just didn't know how little of it he had left. 3 weeks before the Gala Manhattan, The billboard caught Noelle off guard. She was on the crosstown bus, heading to meet Rowan for their weekly dinner, a tradition they'd maintained since he'd started at St. Aurelia, a standing appointment that neither of them broke except for genuine emergencies. The route took her through Midtown, past the towering advertisements that colonized every available surface, selling everything from perfume to politics. She'd learned to tune them out years ago, but this one stopped her breath. 40 feet tall, illuminated even in daylight, dominating the side of a building like a declaration of war, Kellen's face. Older now, silver threading through his dark hair, lines carved around his eyes and mouth. That hadn't been there when she'd known him, but unmistakably, devastatingly him. The same jaw, the same intensity in his gaze, the same expression of absolute certainty that had once made her believe he could conquer the world. He had, apparently, conquered the world. The billboard announced the Armitage Heart Foundation's annual gala, his name in letters large enough to read from 3 blocks away, a slogan beneath his photograph, "Mending Hearts, Saving Lives." Noelle stared at those words until the bus lurched forward and carried her past them. Mending hearts. The irony was so acute it felt like a physical wound. This was the man who had shattered hers, who had been so focused on building his empire that he'd let his marriage crumble into dust, who had looked at the news of his own child and said now, like parenthood was an inconvenient calendar conflict, and now he was funding cardiac research, positioning himself as a healer, buying redemption with charitable donations and glossy advertising campaigns. She wondered if he ever thought about her, about Rowan, about the family he'd thrown away in pursuit of everything that billboard represented. She wondered if he even remembered. The restaurant was a small Italian place near the hospital, chosen because Rowan could walk there in 5 minutes, and because the owner didn't rush them when dinner stretched past closing time. Noelle arrived first, securing their usual table by the window, trying to shake the image of Kellen's face from her mind. She wasn't successful. Rowan appeared 10 minutes later, still in scrubs beneath his jacket, exhaustion written in the shadows under his eyes. But he smiled when he saw her, that genuine, unguarded smile that always reminded her why every sacrifice had been worth it. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Trauma came in right as my shift ended. Couldn't just leave. You never can." She reached across to squeeze his hand. "That's what makes you good at what you do." They ordered the same dishes they always ordered, comfort food that had become ritual, and fell into easy conversation. His cases, her co-workers, the small details of lives lived separately but still intertwined. It wasn't until the pasta arrived that Rowan mentioned it. "You know what's strange? The hospital just got a massive donation from the Armitage Foundation, new equipment for the cardiac wing. Everyone's talking about how the gala is going to be huge this year." Noelle's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Really? Yeah, that tech billionaire. Kellen Armitage." Rowan twirled spaghetti absently. "Apparently he's obsessed with heart disease research. Lost his father to a heart attack when he was young or something. The attendings won't shut up about trying to get invited to the gala." Rowan looked up, catching something in her tone. "Do you know him?" The question hung between them like a held breath. Noelle set down her fork, took a sip of water, searched for words that wouldn't be lies but wouldn't be the whole truth either. "I knew someone like him once," she said carefully. "Ambitious, driven, bad at choosing what matters. What happened to them? They got everything they wanted." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And lost everything they needed." Rowan studied her face for a long moment, that perceptive gaze that saw through patience, deflections and denials, that recognized pain even when it tried to hide. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." She picked up her fork again, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "Tell me about the trauma case. The one that made you late." He let her change the subject, but his eyes lingered on her face, and Noelle knew he'd registered something, filed it away in whatever mental catalog he kept of things that didn't quite add up. The secret she'd carried for 26 years was starting to strain at its seams. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Noelle sat by the window and watched the city lights blur through tears she couldn't explain. She thought about the billboard, about Kellen's face, aged but familiar, staring down at millions of strangers who would never know what he'd really been like, what he'd cost her, what she'd taken from him when she'd left without giving him a chance to find his son. The secrecy had started as protection, for herself, for Rowan, for a wound that was too fresh to expose to air. But 26 years had passed. Rowan was a grown man now, a doctor, someone who dealt with life and death daily, who surely could handle complicated truths. Couldn't he? Or would the revelation destroy the peace they'd built? Would knowing about Kellen, about who his father really was, about the wealth and power he'd been denied, poison everything? She didn't know. She wasn't ready to find out. But the weight of the secret was getting heavier every day, and Noelle was no longer certain she could carry it much longer. The city is small when you have unfinished business. They were walking the same streets now, Noelle and Rowan on their weekly dinners, Kellen in his chauffeured car between meetings and galas. Three people whose lives had been shattered by choices made decades ago, orbiting each other without knowing how close they'd come. The billboard watched over all of them, mending hearts, saving lives, a promise written in lights that none of them quite believed. Collision was coming. They just didn't know it yet. The night of the Gala Grand Meridian Ballroom, Manhattan. The black cars arrived in an endless procession, Rolls-Royces and Bentleys and sleek Tesla sedans lined up along the red carpet, disgorging passengers into a gauntlet of photographers and reporters. The flashes were relentless, each pop of light capturing another billionaire, another celebrity, another face that would grace tomorrow's society pages. This was the Armitage Heart Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of Manhattan's charity season, where the price of admission was $25,000 and the price of being seen was immeasurable. Kellen Armitage stood just inside the entrance, greeting donors as they arrived, his handshake firm and his smile practiced to perfection. He'd done this 100 times before, knew exactly how long to hold eye contact, when to laugh at terrible jokes, how to make each guest feel like they were the most important person in the room, even when his mind was already 3 conversations ahead. Senator Mitchell, so glad you could make it. Patricia, you look stunning. Is that Oscar de la Renta? Harrison, how's the merger coming? We should discuss the Asian markets next week. The mental checklist ticked along beneath the surface charm. Confirm the keynote. Timing with the event coordinator. Check on the silent auction totals. Remember to mention the new pediatric cardiac wing during the speech. Don't forget to thank the Hendricks Foundation for their matching grant. His chest felt tight. He'd noticed it in the car on the way over, a subtle pressure, like someone had placed a hand flat against his sternum and was pressing gently. Nothing alarming, just stress. The gala always wound him up, and he hadn't slept well the night before, and the quarterly projections had been concerning, and his assistant had scheduled 7 meetings tomorrow that couldn't be moved. Stress, that's all it was. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, took a single sip, then set it aside. Alcohol wasn't mixing well with whatever was happening in his chest tonight. Mr. Armitage? His assistant, Miranda, appeared at his elbow with her tablet. The coordinator needs final approval on the seating chart adjustment. Apparently the Thorntons and the Castellanos cannot be at adjacent tables. Put the Hendricks between them. They're neutral ground. Done. Also, your speech is loaded on the teleprompter. You're scheduled for 9:15. He checked his watch. 20 minutes. His left arm tingled. He shook it out, assuming he'd been holding the greeting posture too long. Poor circulation, nothing more. The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. 12,000 Swarovski crystals caught the light above 700 guests seated at tables, draped in silk and crowned with centerpieces that had been flown in from Holland that morning. The orchestra played something classical and unobtrusive. Waiters glided between tables with choreographed precision, ensuring no glass remained empty, no plate lingered too long. Kellen moved through the room, pausing at tables to exchange pleasantries, accepting compliments on the foundation's work, deflecting praise with practiced humility. He was good at this. The performance of philanthropy, the theater of generosity. After 15 years of galas, he could navigate a charity dinner the way other men navigated their living rooms. But something was wrong tonight. The room seemed too bright, the voices too loud. His skin felt clammy beneath his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, and despite the aggressive air conditioning, sweat was gathering at his temples. He excused himself from a conversation with a tech investor and stepped toward the back of the room, seeking a moment of quiet. His hand moved to his chest, an unconscious gesture, pressing against the pressure that wouldn't subside. Just get through the speech, he told himself. 20 minutes, shake hands, pose for photos, then go home and sleep for 12 hours. He could do this. He'd done harder things. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the founder of the Armitage Heart Foundation, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and visionary, Kellen Armitage. The applause was thunderous. Kellen walked toward the stage, each step requiring more concentration than it should have. The spotlight found him immediately, hot and blinding, and for a moment he couldn't see anything except white light and the vague shapes of bodies in the darkness beyond. The host, a television personality whose name he'd temporarily forgotten, was listing his accomplishments. Forbes covers, Time magazine recognition, the billions in clean energy infrastructure, the millions donated to cardiac research, the lives saved, the communities transformed, the legacy built. It sounded impressive when reduced to bullet points. It felt hollow when you were the one who had to live with what the bullet points left out. He reached the podium, gripping its edges to steady himself. The teleprompter glowed with his speech, words he'd approved that afternoon, statistics and gratitude, and the carefully constructed narrative of a man who had devoted his life to healing hearts. The irony tasted like bile. He opened his mouth to speak. The pain hit. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't pressure or discomfort or something that could be blamed on stress. It was a blade between his ribs, a fist around his heart, a full system alarm that his body had finally decided to sound after years of being ignored. The teleprompter words swam, rearranged themselves, became meaningless symbols in a language he was forgetting how to read. His vision tunneled, and there, in the back of the ballroom, half hidden by a pillar, he saw her. Dark hair, elegant posture, a face that looked almost like... No, it wasn't her. It was never her. Every gala, every event, every crowded room for 15 years, he'd seen ghosts of Noelle in strangers' faces. Women who walked like her, laughed like her, tilted their heads at angles that made his heart seize. She was never actually there, but tonight, in the moment before everything went dark, the ghost seemed more real than ever. So, this is how it ends, he thought. And the clarity was almost peaceful. All that work, all that sacrifice, all those years of choosing the company over everything else. His grip on the podium failed. I never got to tell her I was sorry. I never got to meet my son. I never got to find out if they could have forgiven me. The microphone caught his fall first, screeching feedback through the sound system. Then his shoulder hit the stage, then his head, and the screaming started. Guests rising from their seats, security rushing forward, someone shouting for a doctor while someone else was already on the phone with 911. The flashbulbs never stopped. Even as Kellen Armitage lay motionless on the stage of his own charity gala, the cameras kept firing. His crisis was content. His collapse was a story. Tomorrow's headlines were being written in real time by photographers who had come to capture philanthropy and stayed to document disaster. The last thing Kellen heard before consciousness slipped away was the wail of approaching sirens. The last thing he thought was her name, Noelle. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The EMTs arrived in under 4 minutes. They worked with brutal efficiency, cutting away his tuxedo jacket, attaching electrodes, shouting vitals to each other in the clipped language of emergency medicine. The ballroom had descended into controlled chaos, security forming a perimeter while event. Staff tried to manage the guests who were simultaneously horrified and unable to look away. Kellen Armitage, 52 years old, one of the EMTs, reported into his radio. Cardiac event, unresponsive. We're transporting to St. Aurelia, ETA 8 minutes. The gurney rushed through the ballroom, past tables still set with untouched desserts, past guests clutching phones to document. The moment past the silent auction items that would never be claimed, and the orchestra that had stopped playing mid-measure. Outside, the ambulance waited with its doors thrown open. Inside, the gala continued in a daze, donors murmuring to each other, staff fielding questions no one could answer, reporters already crafting the story that would dominate the morning news cycle. Kellen Armitage, the man who had built an empire on the promise of a better future, was fighting for the only future that mattered now. His own. St. Aurelia Medical Center Emergency Department, 9:47 p.m. The night had been quiet, deceptively so. Rowan was reviewing charts at the nurse's station, catching up on documentation during the rare lull between traumas. The ER had a rhythm to it, predictable in its unpredictability, waves of chaos followed by valleys of calm, the calm always temporary, always waiting to be shattered by the next ambulance arrival. He'd learned to use these moments. Update notes, check lab results, grab a protein bar from the vending machine that would serve as dinner, because actual meals were a luxury emergency physicians rarely enjoyed. His pen scratched across a discharge summary. The doors to the ambulance bay remained closed. Talia, the charge nurse who had been at St. Aurelia longer than most of the attendings, appeared at his elbow with an expression he'd learned to recognize. The expression that meant the calm was over. Dr. Chen, we've got a VIP inbound. Define very important person. Kellen Armitage, the billionaire. Collapsed at his own charity gala about 15 minutes ago. EMTs are calling it a possible MI. ETA 4 minutes. The name landed strangely in Rowan's chest. Kellen Armitage. The billboard his mother had stared at. The name that had made her face go still and guarded during dinner. The tech billionaire whose foundation had just donated millions to this very hospital. Do you know him? I knew someone like him once. Rowan pushed the memory aside. A name was just a name. Whatever history existed between his mother and this man, if any existed at all, it had nothing to do with the patient about to come through those doors. What's his age and medical history? Talia checked her tablet. 52. History of hypertension. Family history of cardiac disease. Father died of MI at 43. He's been non-compliant with his cardiologist's recommendations for at least 2 years. Of course he has. Rowan set down his pen. Prep Trauma 1. Full cardiac workup. I want an EKG the second he's through the door and cardiology on standby. Already done. That's why you're the best, Talia. She almost smiled. Don't let it go to your head. The ambulance bay doors exploded open. The gurney came through fast, EMTs flanking it on both sides, their faces tight with the focused urgency of professionals who knew they were carrying someone important. Not important because of his wealth or his name. In the ER, everyone was equal, but important because he was alive and might not stay that way without immediate intervention. 52-year-old male, witnessed collapse at approximately 9:15 p.m., the lead EMT rattled off. Initial rhythm showed ST elevation in leads V1 through V4. We've got him on aspirin, nitro, and a heparin drip. BP's been fluctuating. Dropped to 80% systolic in the bus, currently at 95. He's been in and out of consciousness. Rowan moved alongside the gurney as it rushed toward Trauma 1, already assessing. Airway clear. Breathing labored, but present. Circulation compromised, but holding. Then he looked at the patient's face, and the world tilted. The man on the gurney was older than the billboard had shown, lines carved, deep around his eyes and mouth, silver dominating the hair at his temples, but the bone structure was unmistakable. The jaw, the brow, the shape of the eyes that were currently flickering with semi-consciousness. Rowan knew that face. He knew it because he saw echoes of it every morning in the mirror. No, that's not possible. A name is just a name. But his hands had frozen. His feet had stopped moving. His brain was firing connections he didn't want to make, pulling up fragments of things his mother had said and hadn't said, the way she'd changed the subject when he'd mentioned this man's name, the strange weight she'd carried as long as he could remember. Dr. Chen? Talia's voice cut through the fog. We need to move. Rowan blinked. Professional mode. Now. Whatever this was, whoever this man was, it didn't matter right now. What mattered was the ST elevation, the unstable vitals. The heart that was failing inside the chest of a patient who needed him to be a doctor, not a son with questions. "On my count," Rowan commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. 1, 2, 3. They transferred Kellen to the trauma bay bed in one smooth motion. Monitors were attached, leads placed. The EKG machine began its rhythmic beeping, translating the electrical story of a heart in crisis. "Get me a 12 lead," Rowan ordered. "And where's my troponin?" "Lab's rushing it." "Rush it faster." He moved through the protocols with muscle memory, ordering medications, adjusting oxygen flow, reading the data streaming across the monitors. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. The part of him that had trained for this exact scenario was functioning perfectly. The other part, the part that was screaming questions, he locked in a box and shoved to the back of his mind. Later. Deal with it later. Kellen's eyes opened, unfocused at first, drifting across the ceiling, the lights, the chaos of activity around him. Then they found Rowan's face and held there. "You're..." His voice was weak, thready. "You're young. Don't worry about my age." Rowan leaned into his field of vision, penlight in hand. "You're at St. Aurelia Medical Center. You've had a cardiac event, but we're taking care of you. I need you to stay calm and let us work." He checked pupil response. Equal and reactive. "Good." Kellen's gaze drifted down, searching for something to anchor to. It landed on Rowan's badge, pinned to his white coat. Dr. Rowan Chen. Something flickered in Kellen's expression, confusion maybe, or the ghost of recognition. His lips moved like he was trying to form a word. Then his eyes rolled back. "He's crashing," Talia shouted. The monitor screamed. The rhythm that had been unstable but present dissolved into the jagged chaos of ventricular fibrillation. The heart quivering instead of beating, blood no longer moving, death arriving in electrical waves. "V-fib, get me the pads." Rowan grabbed the defibrillator paddles, muscle memory taking over completely now. There was no room for questions, no space for the identity crisis threatening to crack him open. There was only the protocol, the training, the absolute necessity of converting this rhythm before brain damage set in. Charged to 200. The machine whined as it built power. Everyone clear. The team stepped back. Clear. The shock hit. Kellen's body arced off the table. The monitor showed a flat line, then chaos, then flat again. No rhythm. Charging to 300. Come on, Rowan thought, and the voice in his head was desperate in a way it had never been for any other patient. Stay with me. Don't you dare die on this table. Don't you dare disappear before I know who you really are. Clear. The second shock. Kellen's body convulsed. The monitor held its breath. And then, beep, beep, beep. Sinus rhythm. Weak, but present. A heart that had decided to keep fighting. He's back, Talia breathed. Not out of the woods yet. Get cardiology down here now. He needs a cath lab in the next 20 minutes or we're going to lose him again. The team moved with renewed urgency, preparing for transfer. Rowan stood back for just a moment, watching the rise and fall of Kellen's chest. The steady beep of the monitor that confirmed life was still present. Who are you? The question burned in his mind. Who are you to me? But there was no time for answers. Kellen was being wheeled toward the elevator, toward the cardiac catheterization lab where they would thread a wire through his arteries and find the blockage that had nearly killed him. Rowan followed, unable to step away, unable to let this patient out of his sight. Later, he told himself again, you'll find out later. But the questions wouldn't stop screaming. St. Aurelia Medical Center, Cardiac Intensive Care Unit, 11:42 p.m. Rowan stood outside room 412, chart in hand, unable to make himself enter. The catheterization had been successful. The interventional cardiologist had found and cleared the blockage, a 90% occlusion of the left anterior descending artery, the kind they called the widowmaker because it so rarely gave second chances. Kellen Armitage had gotten his second chance. Whether he deserved it was a question for philosophers, not physicians. The chart told a clinical story, stable vitals, good response to intervention, guarded but optimistic prognosis. The patient would need lifestyle changes, medication compliance, regular follow-up, standard post-ME protocol. But Rowan couldn't stop staring at the admission information. Kellen James Armitage, Dub, March 15, 1972. Emergency contact, none listed. No spouse, no family, no one to call when the most powerful man in clean energy nearly died on the floor of his own charity gala. How did someone build an empire and end up with no one? Rowan's phone was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to use it. His thumbs moved across the screen, typing a message to his mother. Big VIP case from Armitage Gala tonight. Crazy shift. I'll tell you about it later. He hit send. The response came in under 30 seconds. Armitage? Then, before he could reply, I'm coming. Text me the room number. Rowan stared at the message. His mother worked 20 minutes away. It was nearly midnight. She had a shift tomorrow morning, and she was coming. Room 412, he typed back. Cardiac ICU. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Noelle arrived at 12:17 a.m. She was still in scrubs from her own shift, her coat thrown hastily over them, her hair escaping from its ponytail in ways that suggested she'd run from the parking garage. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking. Rowan intercepted her in the hallway outside room 412. Mom, is he? She couldn't finish the question. Her eyes were fixed on the door, on the small window that offered a glimpse of the patient inside. He's stable. The cath went well. He's going to make it. She exhaled, a sound that was half relief and half something else entirely. Something that sounded like grief. Mom? Rowan stepped into her line of sight, forcing her to look at him instead of the door. I need you to tell me the truth. Rowan, is he my father? The question hung in the sterile hospital air, surrounded by the soft beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of night shift staff. Noelle's face crumpled. Yes, she whispered. That's him. Kellen Armitage is your father. The confirmation hit Rowan like a physical blow, even though had known from the moment he'd seen that face on the gurney, had known in his bones the way you know things that are too fundamental to require proof. Why didn't you tell me? I was protecting you. From what? From knowing who I came from understanding why I grew up without a father, from him. Her voice broke. From the man he was becoming, from the way he chose his company over everything, over me, over us, over the family we could have had. That wasn't your choice to make. You're right. Tears were sliding down her cheeks now. You're absolutely right, and I've carried that guilt every single day for 26 years. But I was 25 and pregnant and terrified, and I made the best decision I could with what I knew. You could have told me later, when I was older, when I could have understood. When would that have been, Rowan? When you were 10 and asking why Daddy never visited? When you were 15 and angry at the world? When you were in medical school, studying 18 hours a day? She shook her head. There was never a right time. And the longer I waited, the harder it became. They stood in silence, mother and son, separated by decades of secrets and connected by a love that had survived them. I need to see him, Noelle finally said. Mom, I've spent 15 years running from this moment. I can't run anymore. They entered room 412 together. Kellen was semi-conscious, drifting in the twilight between sleep and awareness that heavy sedation creates. The monitors beeped their steady reassurance, and Ford dripped fluids into his arm. He looked smaller than the billboard had made him seem, diminished by the hospital gown, by the tubes, by the vulnerability that illness imposes on even the most powerful. At the sound of footsteps, his eyes opened. He saw Rowan first, the young doctor who had saved his life, whose face had triggered something he couldn't name in the trauma bay. His brow furrowed with confusion, with the effort of thinking through the pharmaceutical haze. Then his gaze shifted, and he saw her. Noelle? Her name emerged broken, barely audible, carrying 15 years of longing and regret in 2 syllables. She stepped closer to the bed, and Rowan saw something pass between them, a recognition. That transcended words, a history that filled the room like a fourth presence. Hello, Kellen. You're here. He was crying now, tears sliding from the corners of his eyes into his silver-threaded hair. "After all this time, you're actually here." "I'm here." His gaze moved back to Rowan, standing slightly behind his mother, protective and uncertain. Kellen's eyes traveled over the younger man's features, the jaw, the brow, the shape of the eyes, cataloging the similarities, making calculations that his sedated mind could barely complete. "Is he—" The question trailed off, too enormous to finish. Noelle took a breath, reached back to take Rowan's hand, drawing him forward. "Our son," she said. "Rowan is our son." The words landed like stones in still water. Kellen's face collapsed. His hand reached toward Rowan, trembling, desperate to touch proof of what he'd just been told. "I have a son." The wonder in his voice was devastating. "All this time, I have a son, and I didn't." "You didn't know," Noelle said quietly. "I left before I could tell you properly." "The letter—" Kellen's eyes widened with sudden, terrible clarity. "You left a letter. I found the ring, but there was no letter. I thought you wanted nothing to do with me. I wrote everything down, explained about the baby, about why I was leaving. I put it under the ring by the coffee maker. It wasn't there. I looked everywhere. Your assistant—" Noelle's voice was bitter with old frustration. She must have picked it up with the mail, thought it was correspondence. "I never even considered—" "Miranda." Kellen closed his eyes. She was always efficient, always making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. A broken laugh escaped him. "All the things I double-checked, all the details I obsessed over, and the most important message I ever received slipped away because someone was trying to be helpful." The irony was suffocating. Rowan spoke for the first time since entering the room. "You almost died tonight." Kellen turned toward his voice, toward this stranger who was also his son, who had fought to save his life without knowing why it mattered so much. "You were surrounded by people who would have written nice tributes and moved on," Rowan continued. "Colleagues who would have praised your legacy. Business partners who would have attended the funeral and then divided up your assets. But the person who actually fought to keep your heart beating, the one who refused to let you code out on that table, was the kid you didn't even know existed." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. "I'm sorry." Kellen's voice cracked. "I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't cover 26 years of absence. But I'm sorry. For everything. For choosing the company over your mother. For not fighting harder to find her when she left. For building an empire while my actual family was out there, living without me." "Sorry doesn't fix it," Rowan said. "I know. But it's a start." Father and son looked at each other, one in a hospital bed, the other in a white coat, both navigating terrain that had no map. "Life has a way of forcing conversations," Rowan said slowly. "When you spend too long ignoring what your heart is trying to tell you, you ignored yours until it literally gave out. Maybe that's the universe's way of making you pay attention. Maybe—" Kellen's hand was still extended toward his son. "Can I—" Rowan hesitated. Every abandoned child's worth of anger and hurt burned in his chest. This man had missed everything. First steps, first words, graduations, victories, failures. The entire architecture of a life built without him. But he was also a patient, a father, a broken man who had just learned he had a son. Rowan took his hand. Kellen's fingers closed around his, trembling, desperate. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving my life. It's my job." "No." Kellen shook his head. "It's more than that. It has to be more than that." Rowan didn't answer, but he didn't let go either. If you were in Rowan's shoes, finding out you just saved the life of the father who never knew you existed, would you be able to forgive him? Would you want to try? Or would the weight of 26 years be too heavy to lift? Let me know in the comments. Because forgiveness isn't simple, and I think everyone watching this has their own answer. And if you want more stories that hit the heart like this one, stories about love and loss and the complicated work of becoming family, make sure you're subscribed, because this story isn't over yet. St. Aurelia Medical Center, Cardiac Intensive Care Unit, 2:17 a.m. The crisis had passed, but the reckoning had just begun. Rowan stood at his father's bedside, watching the steady green line trace its path across the cardiac monitor. Each peak represented a heartbeat, fragile evidence that Kellen Armitage was still alive, still present, still given a chance that millions never receive. The question was whether he would do anything meaningful with it. Rowan's hand hovered near his father's, not quite touching, suspended, in the uncertain space between connection and self-protection. 26 years of absence couldn't be bridged by a single gesture. Forgiveness wasn't a light switch you could flip in a hospital room at 2 in the morning. But beginnings had to start somewhere. Slowly, deliberately, Rowan let his fingers rest against his father's hand. Not holding it, not yet, but acknowledging it. A point of contact that said, "I'm here. I'm willing to try. Don't make me regret it." Kellen's breath caught at the touch. On his other side, Noel reached out and brushed the silver hair from his forehead. The gesture was automatic, rising from some deep well of muscle memory, the same way she'd touched him decades ago, when they were young and poor and impossibly in love. The familiarity of it surprised her. The ache that accompanied it did not. "You're both here," Kellen whispered. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will have been some kind of dream, or hallucination from the medication." "It's real," Noel said quietly. "We're real. I don't deserve this." "Probably not." Rowan's voice was steady, without malice. "But here we are anyway." Kellen stared at the ceiling, gathering words that felt inadequate for the weight they needed to carry. "I spent my whole life chasing security," he said finally. "Every decision, every sacrifice, every missed dinner and canceled plan. I told myself it was about building something stable, something permanent, something that would prove I wasn't the scared kid whose father died and left nothing behind." He turned his head to look at Noel. "But I made the people who loved me feel the least secure of all. I was so focused on providing that I forgot what provision actually means. It's not money, it's not success, it's presence, it's showing up when it matters. Kellen, I thought success would prove I was worth loving." His voice cracked. "I thought if I just built something big enough, impressive enough, undeniable enough, then no one could ever leave me. No one could ever look at me and see someone who wasn't enough." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I guaranteed that everyone would leave. Because I was never actually there for them to stay with." Rowan absorbed his father's confession in silence. He thought about all the patients he'd treated in the ER, wealthy and poor, powerful and powerless. He thought about the ones who died surrounded by loved ones and the ones who died alone. He thought about what distinguished the two groups, and how rarely it had anything to do with money. "You want to know what I've learned working here?" Rowan said. "Your money won't sit by your bed when you're dying. Your titles don't show up to say goodbye. The empire you spent your life building doesn't hold your hand when you're scared." He met his father's eyes. "People do. Or they don't. And which one happens depends entirely on how you showed up for them when they needed you, when it was inconvenient, when there was something more important calling." "I didn't show up," Kellen acknowledged. "No, you didn't. I convinced myself that working harder was the same as loving harder. That sacrificing time was noble because I was sacrificing it for our future. But you were the only one who wanted that future," Rowan said. "Mom just wanted you, present, paying attention, choosing her over the company once in a while. I know that now. Knowing isn't enough. The question is what you do with the knowing." Noel had been quiet, listening to her son articulate truths she'd carried alone for decades. Hearing them spoken aloud, validated by this young man who had never met his father, but somehow understood exactly what had gone wrong, was both painful and liberating. "I don't know what comes next," she finally said. "I don't know if I'm ready to unpack 20 years of hurt. There are things I haven't forgiven, things I may never fully forgive." "I understand," Kellen said, "but life just reminded you how fragile it is. You got a warning that most people don't survive." She gestured at the monitors, the clinical evidence of his near death. "If we keep letting pride and fear make our choices for us, we're going to run out of time to fix anything." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm tired of running, tired of carrying secrets, tired of protecting myself from a man who might have changed if I'd given him the chance." "Noel, But I need to see the change, Kellen. Not promises, not intentions, actions. Consistent, sustained actions that prove this hospital bed actually taught you something. I'll do whatever it takes. That's what you said 20 years ago, about the company stabilizing, about having more time later. The words landed like stones. I know. Kellen's voice was barely audible. I know I've broken every promise I ever made. I know I have no right to ask for trust I haven't earned. He looked at both of them, this woman he'd loved and lost, this son he'd never known. But if I get another chance, if this heart keeps beating, I want to use whatever time I have left showing up, for both of you. If you'll let me. The room fell silent except for the monitors. 3 people, connected by blood and history and loss, standing at a crossroads that none of them had expected to reach. Noelle moved first. She reached down and took Kellen's hand, threading her fingers through his the way she'd done countless times in their tiny apartment in their early days, when touch was the language they spoke most fluently. Rowan watched, hesitated, then placed his hand over both of theirs. 3 hands layered together. 3 lives intersecting at last. On the monitor, Kellen's heart continued its steady rhythm, damaged but beating, broken but not beyond repair. This isn't a fairy tale ending. There was no magical reconciliation in that hospital room. No group hug that erased decades of absence. No promise that everything would be perfect from this moment forward. What there was, what there is a doorway. A chance that didn't exist 24 hours earlier. A conversation that might never have happened if a heart hadn't finally demanded to be heard. The road ahead won't be easy. There will be therapy and difficult conversations, boundaries that feel unfair, and progress that feels too slow. Setbacks that make them all wonder if trying was worth it. But there is also possibility now. Connection. The fragile, precious beginning of something that might, with enough patience, enough courage, enough grace, become a family. Pride can cost us years we can never get back. Silence, even well-intentioned silence, often wounds deeper than uncomfortable truth. Chasing success while neglecting relationships and health eventually makes success feel hollow, a trophy with no one to show it to. Time, not money, is the real luxury. And the richest life is one where your heart isn't bankrupt. If this story made you think about the people in your own life, the calls you haven't made, the apologies you've been putting off, the relationships you've let drift because life got busy, share it with someone you care about. Drop a comment and tell me, what's one relationship you're going to show up for differently after hearing this? And if you want more long stories with real lessons about life, love, and second chances, hit that like button, subscribe to Mr. Blackwood Long Stories, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Because we can't rewrite the chapters we've already lived. But as long as we're still here, still breathing, still blessed with one more heartbeat, we can choose to write the next ones with a braver heart.